Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto is an immortal Fullmetal Alchemist. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by SALEM52 and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Prologue. 9 derricks, there are none better, cried out a man on a raised platform. The late day sun bore down on him, prompting him to adjust his long-sleeved tunic and headcloth to cover more of his exposed skin. Next to him were young 2 men, bound and shackled to posts that rose out of the platform, who had no such protection and were taking the full effect of its heat. This man was one of many in the great capital city of Xerxes who made their living off the slave trade. The oasis city of Xerxes was the capital city of the small country of Xerxes, which was located in the middle of the great desert. The city was built around a large oasis which watered the entire country. As people would travel between the rivers of the east and the mountains of the west, they would stop in Xerxes to rest and revitalize their camels. Thus, being a natural crossroads between 2 civilizations, Xerxes grew off the trade and soon became the biggest trade city in the 3 lands. The market of Xerxes was a hub of trade for those traveling between the mountain civilizations of the west and the river folk of the east. The eastern folk would bring great camel trains of rice, silk, and porcelain to trade for the ironworks, furs and wood of the mountain folk. Xerxes was also the capital of the prominent slave trade, due the supply being available to both races of people. Outside of the throng of the market, there could be found numerous inns and taverns. On the outskirts of the city were vast expanses of packed earth, where large caravans would set up massive tents and prepare their wares for the market. In the center of the city, west of the market, was the palace temple of the king. The current king of Xerxes had had a long successful reign over the country, bringing many great things to it. The man's most overwhelming achievement was the creation of numerous irrigation ducts throughout the country. His years were catching up to him though, and there were suspicions that the crown was soon going to pass on to his son. In one of the numerous taverns throughout the city was a man. This man was an oddity. He shared many of the characteristics of those native to Xerxes, such as the long blonde hair that was prominent amongst the Xerxes or the fair skin, unusual considering the desert environment. He had the high cheekbones possessed by the Xerxean royalty. But he was a head higher than any Xerxean, standing at a good 6 feet. But the most jarring difference was his eyes, while those who hailed from Xerxes were known and identified by their golden eyes. His eyes were a deep glacial blue. This man's name was Naruto. He was traveling to the river countries of the east to see if he could find the origins of the porcelain, which had just come to the trade markets in the last 2 decades or so. He was passing through Xerxes, as it was a natural resting point for travelers such as him. He had been there for 4 days, resting his camel so that it could make the long journey to the east. He had also come for one last visit to the old king. Naruto was currently laying on the bed provided by the inn, taking refuge from the sun and just listening to the bustle of the market in the streets below. He had been thinking about the old king, humane. Naruto had heard about the old king's derangement from one of the trade caravans that had come back from Xerxes to restock and resell what they had attained. The king had become obsessed with the pursuit of immortality and was offering large sums of money to anyone who could help him on his endeavors. While Naruto was going to leave before the week was out, he was going to try and talk to the king at least. If nothing else, he could say his last goodbye to him because he would not be returning to Xerxes for a long time. He felt the king would be dead before he would be back to that city again. Naruto was shaken from his thoughts by a knock at the door to his room. He took his time, getting up and stretching slowly before answering. He opened the door, letting in a stout man with black hair and a full beard. He turned toward the man and looked at him for a moment, then lay back on the bed. He then shrugged and flicked his hand towards the man in a dismissive manner. The man nodded, before disappearing into a cloud of smoke to reveal another Naruto. "Dismiss," spoke Naruto. His voice was that of a young man somewhere in his mid-20s. The second Naruto nodded again, disappearing in a cloud of smoke, completely this time. The Naruto on the bed stiffened for a fraction of a second before sitting up and running his hand through his hair. "Well, he's gone a little batshit crazy now, hasn't he?" rang out a voice in Naruto's head. "Yay, he's a lot different than the man I left here 15 years ago," replied Naruto. "That's an understatement, he's not only gone off the deep end since then, he's drowned in it and they're just finding his body," stated the voice again. "I might have to stay longer. If what I saw was correct, Yumein would do anything for immortality, even jeopardize his people's safety. A man who cares nothing for others is dangerous," concluded Naruto to the now identified Kurama. He sighed before shrugging his shoulders and got out of bed. "I guess I will have to talk some sense into him." "And if you can't talk some sense into him?" inquired Kurama. Naruto didn't respond, instead heading toward his bag of possessions by the door. He started the arduous task of unlacing it. "If I can't," replied Naruto, "then I will at least leave this city with the knowledge that I tried." Naruto began pulling out some clothes from his bag. The clothing consisted of a black high-collared coat that draped down to his ankles, a burgundy red undershirt, black pants with red stripes, and a straw hat commonly worn by the river folk of the East. The black cloak was very well worn and looked as if it had a motif of some kind in it, but had worn out after years of constant use. After dressing, he pulled on a set of red Jetta sandals, which just added to his height, making him stand out from the Xerxian population and their rather short stature. He tied his bag back up and pulled out a gold derrick, the currency of Xerxes, and placed it on his bed for the person who would inevitably come to clean his room. He then went up to the window, hopped onto the ledge, and looked across the entirety of Xerxes. This was the reason he chose this inn for his stay. It was located on the only hill in Xerxes and provided a prime viewpoint of all of Xerxes. Naruto took a deep breath, taking in the city below him. He looked into the sky to see the sun nearing the horizon, bathing the city in a red hue that made the walls of stucco look like they were bleeding. The city was just as beautiful as it was ominous. "It's getting late," Naruto said to himself, before looking at the road from his inn to the temple palace of the king. The only downside to this inn was that it was located on the outskirts of the city, nowhere close to the palace. "Well, I guess the king will be getting a surprise visitor," said Naruto to himself, before leaping out of his window and slowly making his way to the palace. In the temple palace, Van Hohenheim was doing the final preparations for the most important task ever given to him in his life. Transcend the bonds of death and make King Humaean immortal. Van Hohenheim was a young man of 23. He stood at around 5'8" tall for man of Xerxian descent. He had long blonde hair that was tied in a low ponytail, although a few strands hung in front of his face, refusing to stay bound. He wore a loose black shirt and a beige coat that was more reminiscent of monk's robes than an actual coat. Blue pants hung loose about his waist, cut off at the calves, showing muscled legs of one who had worked most of his life. Van, as he preferred to be called, was kneeling next a large array of circles, triangles, and symbols that was the hallmark of the scientific art that was alchemy. The array had a diameter of about 5 men if they stood at arm's length from each other. While the array was covered in multitudes of symbols and writing, the core design was hexagram inscribed upon a circle with triangle inside of the hexagram. The large piece of black chalk was Van's tool of choice as he made intricate patterns of lines and circles that would allow the king a chance at immortality. Next to him, on a large pedestal, was a peculiar thing. This thing seemed to be a small floating mass of formless shadow, with one large eye and a mouth. It was contained within a glass flask that was usually used to hold highly acidic liquids. "That looks to be correct, Van, good job," said the little mass of shadow, sprouting arms and clapping a few times, before having them recede back into its body. Van looked up at the mass of shadows, before smiling a little and standing. He then turned towards the little thing and bowed. "Thank you, dwarf in the flask. Without you I could not have achieved anything in my life. I would have stayed as number 23 and would have known nothing other than my blind ignorance. For this, I am eternally in your debt," stated Van, leaning back up to see the dwarf in the flask smiling greatly. "You did well, Van. However, I have told you numerous times that your blood gave me life, so I am only repaying a debt," replied the black mass, before its hands reappeared and opened themselves up in a come-pick-me-up motion, like a child wishing for a parent to lift them up. Van only smiled before walking up to the pedestal and lifting the glass flask up and putting it under his arm. "Now, Van, summon your king. We need everyone to be present for the start of the ritual," said the dwarf in the flask. The sun had just dipped under the horizon when Naruto began the final stretch of road up to King's Palace, known as the Final Road. The sky was filled with dark purples and deep blues as twilight quickly came upon the city of Xerxes. Lights could be seen across the city, and great bonfires appeared on the outskirts of the city, created by the various caravans that did not stay in any of the inns. The final road was lined with the houses of the local nobility, those which could afford to stay close to the king. Despite being the time when everyone would return from the bustle of day to prepare for the frivolities of night, the final road was surprisingly empty. Not a single house on the road up to the king's palace was lit up, leading Naruto to believe that the king was having an event of some kind. If that was the case, then Naruto's information gathering ability had greatly diminished, or the event was kept under wraps. "Well, I guess I might be crashing a party as well," said Naruto to himself. "You don't know, it could be fun, haven't been to any big events in a while, now have we?" Rang out the voice in Naruto's head once again. "Kurama, what have I said before? You shouldn't talk when we are in public places. If people see me randomly spacing out, they will think I have an illness or something," replied Naruto annoyed. "Well, it is quite dull in here. After all, one can only get so much entertainment from looking at a wall before they start getting bored," retorted Kurama. "Besides, what would you care if they thought you were crazy, you'll outlive them anyway." "Sorry, I thought the illusion I put in there would still be up," replied Naruto, disregarding Kurama's last statement. When we get Naruto was cut off by a loud explosion of sound. The earth started to roll and shake, knocking him down in surprise. Earthquake? Thought Naruto in surprise, looking at the shaking buildings around him and at the crumbling castle. No, it's not an earthquake, stated Kurama wearily, before he grunted in shock. Kid, it's chakra. Can't you feel it? Yelled out Kurama inside of Naruto's head. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise before he closed them and looked as if he was focusing quite hard. A split second later he leapt up and started to rush towards the castle at inhuman speeds. How the hell is there Senjutsu chakra in this day and age and this much? This is comparable to the fucking Biju, thought Naruto. He ran all the way up to the gates of the palace and was about to vault over them when a great purple shockwave of light exploded from the castle, causing Naruto to go flying into the wall of one of the nobles' buildings on the final road. Damn, I haven't had a hit like that in years, he groaned before standing up and rubbing his back. He looked toward the palace. A light rose up then streaked across the night sky, illuminating Xerxes as though it were day. Naruto just stood there looking at the light streaking across the sky, then began looking around himself. Black fissures began appearing in the earth with thousands upon thousands of grasping hands rising out of them. Alright, those don't look friendly, thought Naruto as he began dodging the small hands. As he kept on dodging, he looked up to see a massive eye slowly open up over the castle. Well, that doesn't look good. No shit, let's try to find out what is in the castle that is causing this, recommended Kurama. Naruto nodded in agreement. He began to make his way towards the palace, all the while dodging the numerous black hands that were trying to grab him. Before he could make any sizable progress to the palace though, the eye above the castle opened completely. Before he could even think about doing anything other than turn slightly to run, a massive beam of blinding white light came down and struck the castle. The last thing Naruto heard, before blacking out, was the scream of pain of 1,072,659 people simultaneously having their souls forcibly ripped from their body. What is this? Cried out Yuman as he looked at his frail old hands, shrinking even more as the life energy was being forcefully removed from his body. This can't possibly be immortality, you tricked me. The king looked over toward the dwarf in the flask as a horrible pain assaulted his body and he crumbled onto the ground. The dwarf in the flask started cackling loudly as its small body started to glow a sickly purple. Yuman, you old fool, did you think you were the center of the array? Did you think I did all that work just for charity? The dwarf in the flask screamed at the dying king. Dwarf in the flask, what is happening? Asked Van fearfully. This wasn't what you said would happen. You said the king would be in the center, you said he would become immortal. The dwarf in the flask stopped cackling before turning its one eye towards Van and smiling evilly. What did you think would happen, Van Hohenheim? Queried the dwarf in the flask, extending its arms out of its body and holding them in above itself, as though it were trying to grab the heavens. The price of immortality would obviously not come without an equivalent cost. Something cannot be attained without giving up something of equal value. This the first rule of alchemy. Whoever stands at the center of the array would transcend humanity and become immortal, but everyone else would pay the price, and right now, Van Hohenheim, we are the center of everything. Cried out the dwarf in the flask, madly, as a white light enveloped them both. Van screamed as he felt the souls of over 500,000 people being forced into his being, merging with his very existence. The last thing he heard, before blacking out from the pain, was the earth-shattering roar of some great beast and the light tinkling of breaking glass. For those who remember. The 3 rules of alchemy. 1. Equivalent exchange. In order to obtain or create something, something of equal value must be lost or destroyed. 2. Transmutation. In order to transmute, a focus must be created, without, all transmutations will unequivocally fail. 3. Human transmutation. Human transmutation is strictly forbidden, for while the materials of transmutation may be obtained, for what could equal the value of a human soul? Edward Elric was sitting in a chair at the only open-air bar in the desert city of Lear. If one were to look at Ed, they would see a young man of 15 with long blonde hair, a long red coat, and a rather short stature. He wore a short-sleeved black shirt and pair of long black pants. He wore white gloves, and a pocket watch chain was hanging out his right pants pocket attached to a utility belt on his abdomen. On the back of his red coat was a depiction of the Flammel. A cross encircled by a snake and crowned with wings and a halo. Sitting next to him was his younger brother, Alphonse Elric, who was in a great suit of metal armor, also sporting the Flammel on his left shoulder. The suit was easily 6 feet tall, suggesting that he was much larger than his older brother. The city that they were in, Lear, was located in eastern section of the country of Amistris. Amistris was very militaristic, its land that primarily attained through the conquest of neighboring city-states and countries. Amistris itself was a major alchemical superpower, the world leader in New Age alchemy. Alchemy played a key role in conquering their neighboring nations. In Amistris, the highest office for an alchemist was the coveted position of state alchemist. Edward Elric was the youngest state alchemist in history. God's children who live upon this land, blared the radio on the counter next to Ed, pray in faith and ye shall be saved. Ed looked at the radio in slight annoyance before turning back to the food on his plate, tuning out the voice of the preacher. He sat there for a moment longer, looking down at his food before looking up at the bartender's curious gaze. Ed sighed before taking a swig of his drink. "So, are you guys circus performers or something?" inquired the bartender. Ed opened his eyes in shock before spitting out his drink and coughing in exasperation. "Do we actually look like circus performers to you?" inquired Ed, slightly annoyed. "Well yeah," replied the bartender, "there was another guy here who looked like he was from the circus as well, but I didn't ask him, cause I thought it would be impolite. But then you guys come along and I just as had to ask." Ed growled in annoyance before hopping off his seat. "Come on Al, let's go," said Ed as he turned to leave. The large suit of armor next to Ed nodded and got up. But as he turned, his arm brushed the radio, causing it to fall and break into multiple pieces. "Hey!" cried out the bartender in indignation, "I didn't mean nothing by what I said, and that radio is a lot of money." Ed turned and held out his hands in a placating manner. "No worries, it was just an accident," stated Ed before reaching into his utility belt, pulling out a stick of chalk and handing it to his brother. "We can fix this." "But how?" "The thing's smashed to bits," the bartender inquired curiously. The commotion was garnering the attention of a few passers-by who stopped to watch how the two brothers were going to fix the radio. Ed only smiled and gestured to his brother. "Just watch and learn, Gramps," said Ed smugly as his brother drew a circle on the ground with a simple six-sided pentagram inscribed upon it. Within minutes, the circle was completed. After placing the pieces of the radio onto the circle, Al held his hand above it and a moment later the bright blue light of an alchemical reaction engulfed the bits of radio. When the light dimmed, it revealed a brand new radio that showed nothing of its previous state of disrepair. For it is through his light that spouted out the radio as though nothing happened. The crowd of onlookers awed in amazement. The bartender turned away from his radio to look at the brothers. "It's a miracle," he breathed out, amazed, "you must have been touched by the sun god Leto, just like Father Cornello." "I've been touched by who?" asked Ed, confused. The bartender looked at them, his mouth gaping open in astonishment. "It's not a miracle," interjected Al, his voice that of a young child, "it's just alchemy." "Oh, then you guys are alchemists," stated one of the onlookers. "Yay, I've heard of them," added another of the crowd. Ed smirked before striking a flamboyant pose and pointing towards himself and Al. "Then you've all probably heard of us," stated Ed, "we're the Elric brothers." "The Elric brothers?" inquired the bartender. "Oh yeah. I've heard that name before. You're the Fullmetal Alchemist, Edward Elric," exclaimed another one of the onlookers. Ed smiled and closed his eyes, basking in the praise of the crowd until he got pushed out the way. Realizing only now that the crowd was mistaking his brother, his taller brother, for himself. He was about to shout at the crowd to let them know that he was the Fullmetal Alchemist when his brother's voice rang out amongst the crowd. I'm not the Fullmetal Alchemist," said Al. The crowd went immediately silent before simultaneously looking at Ed in disbelief. "That little shrimp is the Fullmetal Alchemist?" inquired one of the crowd who was actually voicing the entire crowd's thoughts. Ed growled in heavy annoyance before screaming. "Who's little? Come and say that to my face, you bastards," yelled out Ed, chasing down the crowd of people who would dare taunt him about his height. His stature was always a touchy subject. It wasn't his fault that he hadn't hit his growth spurt yet, or such were the delusions that Ed fed himself on a daily basis. After calming down, Ed walked back up to the bar and sat down on one of the stools before looking at the bartender. "So, who's the guy who is preaching on the radio?" inquired Ed to the bartender. The bartender was a little wary of Ed's outburst, but obligingly answered his question, not wanting to anger him. "That's our leader, Father Cornello," explained the bartender. "We were lost until he came to our city. He taught us the ways of the sun god Leto, who grants immortal life to the souls of the faithful. People even say that he resurrects the dead. The Father's miracles are proof of Leto's power." Ed scowled at the way the man spoke. A devout believer. "So," Ed began, "this guy's claiming he can bring the dead back to life. This is something I have to see." Ed turned to Al before nodding and turning back to the bartender. "If it is alright, could you tell us where we could find Father Cornello?" asked Ed. The bartender smiled before replying. "So you wish to learn of Leto's ways," he said reverently. "You can always find Cornello at the Church of Leto in the center of the city, and you're in luck. Today he is performing mass at 12:30 at the church. If you hurry, you could make it before he starts." Ed nodded, pulling a wallet out of an interior pocket of his coat, pulling out a wad of paper cents, the currency of Amistris, and placing it on the counter of the bar. He turned and started down the road toward the center of the city and, presumably, this Father Cornello's miracles. Ed and Al looked on in silence as the crowd around them roared for the umpteenth time. For the last hour or so, this Father Cornello had been doing miracles and he had just completed another one, transmuting a flower that he had caught from one of the crowd into a larger red and yellow version of the same flower. The only difference between the two was the fact that the larger flower was made of precious gems instead of the organic plant matter of the smaller flower. Ed turned toward his brother. "So, Al, what do you think?" inquired Ed, wanting Al's input on the priest's miracles. "Well, there is no doubt that Father Cornello's miracles are definitely alchemy," replied Alphonse. Ed nodded before returning his gaze to Cornello. He was about to make another comment when a voice made itself known between the brothers. "Those are some pretty cool tricks, ain't they?" said the voice. Ed and Al made a sound of exclamation as they backed a step away from the owner of the voice. Ed looked up to see an oddly dressed man. The man stood at about 6 foot even and had long blonde hair like Ed's, albeit a little wilder. One of the most striking features was the man's deep blue eyes, which was quite rare for Amistris, as the most common eye color was brown and green. As for his dress, he wore a burgundy dress shirt with the top button undone, an old black high-collared coat that went down to his ankles, and loose black dress-style pants. He also had on a conical straw hat that was most commonly used by the rice farmers in Far of Sheen. On the man's feet was the oddest pair of sandals that Ed had ever seen. They were, essentially, two flat pieces of wood that were attached to the feet by pieces of padded leather. On the soles of the sandals were two wooden protrusions that extended down from the sandal about 3 inches. After a moment of staring at the man, Ed finally managed to respond. "Who are you?" inquired Ed. The man only shrugged before replying, "Nobody, really, just a traveler." Ed scowled. "You're dressed pretty oddly for a nobody," retorted Ed. The man only gave a half smile. "You're one to be talking short stuff." Ed growled in anger before launching himself at the man, screaming. "Who are you calling so small, you couldn't even feel them if you stepped on them?" The man dodged to the side, letting Ed sail past him before laughing wholeheartedly. "You know what, kid, I like you. I think I might just tag along with you," stated the man, extending a hand down to Ed. Ed looked up at the hand for a moment before grasping it and pulling himself up. "What make you think you can tag along with us?" inquired Ed indignantly. The man only smiled wider. "Who said you had a choice?" he replied before extending his hand again, except this time in greetings. "What's your name, kid?" inquired the man. "Edward Elric, and you?" The man stopped for a moment before smiling. "My name, well, I guess you could call M. Naruto Uzumaki." Naruto was sitting in one of the pews a few rows behind the Elric brothers. They were all in the grand church of the sun god Leto. He wore a smile like always, except this one was more grim. He had just heard the older Elric brother, Ed, list off the ingredients of the human body like a shopping list to one of the fanatics of Leto, a girl by the name of Rose. After which, he told her the tale of Daedalus and Icarus. "That is some obscure knowledge. Since Xerxes was destroyed, I'm surprised anyone even knows of Greece, even if it is only through their tales," said Naruto to himself. He half expecting a voice to resound through his head. When he heard no response, he sighed and stood up in the pews and walked over to the brothers. "You know," started off Naruto, grasping Ed's shoulder, "as much as I know you like disproving other people's beliefs, I believe you came here for something." Ed looked at Naruto warily before brushing Naruto's hand off his shoulder and turning towards Rose. He sighed. "Rose, do you think your father Cornello could convert a poor old sinner like me?" said Ed, almost choking on the false sincerity that he had put into that statement. Rose's eyes lit up in happiness. "Of course. Father Cornello will help anyone who comes to his church seeking redemption in the eyes of our Lord," she exclaimed, choosing to forget the previous conversation, wanting to instead help Ed's poor lost soul. "You don't mind if I tag along, do you?" he inquired. Rose just nodded enthusiastically before dashing off to a side door, yelling. "I'll be back. I have to let Father Cornello know that you have come to be saved. I will be back in just a moment." With that said, she disappeared behind a door and left the trio of travelers alone. They all stood there for a moment until Naruto decided to move to sit on one of the pews. He looked at the brothers, expecting them to sit, before shrugging and crossing his arms in front of himself. "So, Ed, where'd you read the story of Daedalus and Icarus?" inquired Naruto. He leaned back and put his arms behind his head, having found that having his arms crossed in front of himself was not comfortable. Ed was apparently just as surprised as Naruto that someone else knew of the ancient tale. He just stared at Naruto for a moment before slightly shaking his head and replying, "When I was younger, I had an accident. While I was recovering I had a lot of time to research and I came upon the history of Xerxes and part of their cultures and stories. I guess they just caught my interest." "How do you know about it?" "As you know, this is not exactly common knowledge. You're the first person I've ever met who's even heard of Daedalus and Icarus." Naruto struck a thoughtful pose. Well, I guess you could call me a historian, replied Naruto, which wasn't a complete lie. He probably knew more about the history of the world than any other person on it. Ed nodded in understanding, accepting that answer. They sat there in relative silence until Rose came in about 10 minutes later with another man, a brother Cray. Cray bowed to them before leading them through a door at the side of the auditorium. He brought them down several floors before stopping in front of two large wooden doors guarded by two men in white robes bearing long spears. "The father will see you now," said Brother Cray before opening the double doors and leading them into a large cavernous underground room. "Good, we don't have a lot of time," replied Ed, annoyed that they had been brought all the way down to some room just to see Father Cornello. "Well then," stated Brother Cray, stopping a few paces ahead of the group, "let's make this quick." Brother Cray spun around to face them, holding a large caliber revolver and pointing it directly at Alphonse. Rose gasped in surprise when one of the men in the white robes grabbed her and forced away from the group and the inevitable bullets that would be loosed upon them. "Brother Cray, what is the meaning of this?" she exclaimed in surprise and no small amount of fear. Brother Cray looked over at her before turning his eyes back to Alphonse. "These men are heathens, Rose. They are here to try to disprove and discredit Leto and our Father Cornello. They must be purged," he cried out before pulling the trigger of his gun and shooting the metal-clad head of Alphonse. "No, Alphonse," cried out Rose as the metal helmet launched from the suit of armor only to reveal the suit to be empty. "What?" exclaimed the man in surprise, shocked at the empty metal suit. "Well, now that is very interesting," came a voice from behind Cray. Everyone gasped in surprise, not having seen Naruto move or even notice him until he had spoken. How did he move that fast? Everyone wondered. Cray tried to distance himself so that he could see Naruto, but before he could even make a move to get away, a sharp pain entered his back. The last thing he felt before blacking out was two hands wrapping themselves around his head and twisting. Everyone gasped again, except this time in shock as a fellow human being had just been killed. Ed looked at the falling body, watched as it crumpled to the floor. His face morphed into a mask of hate and anger. "Why did you kill him, you bastard?" cried out Ed, clapping his hands together and pressing them into the ground. Blue light flowed from his hands, just like when Alphonse had fixed up the radio. This time though, there was no radio, instead, the very ground rose up and enveloped Naruto in a cocoon of hard rock and stone. Naruto's eyes widened. For the first time in a long while he was truly surprised. "I'm just seeing all kinds of interesting things today now, aren't I?" stated Naruto, not even trying to escape from his sedimentary prison. "Shut up," yelled out Ed in anger, "that man didn't need to die, why did you kill him?" The perpetual smile that was on Naruto's face disappeared to be replaced with a scowl. "Ed," started off Naruto, his voice very serious, "what do you think Cray would have done after his shock had worn off? Do you think he would just throw down his gun and say, 'Oh well, I tried'?" queried Naruto. Ed just stayed silent, looking down. To answer the question, no, he would have resumed firing, most likely at you. Or threatened to shoot Rose until he was in a more favorable position to kill you and your brother. Remember Ed, nothing and no one is more important than those who are closet to your heart. Ed didn't respond. He just stood there with his head down, knowing that what Naruto was saying was not only plausible, but incredibly likely. "Brother," said Alphonse soothingly. Ed snapped out of his anger and looked toward Alphonse. "Yeah, Al?" inquired Ed. Al looked bashful, if a suit of armor could accomplish such a feat. Well, I don't really like that he killed that man, I can understand where he is coming from. He did it to protect us." So, for that, it was then that Alphonse turned to the still cocooned Naruto and bowed toward him. "Thank you very much, Naruto, for protecting my brother, Rose, and I." Naruto only looked toward Alphonse before smiling and shrugging, or as best he could, considering his current situation. "No problem Al, just make sure your brother doesn't blow up at me next time and also watch your step, I don't think those two would appreciate you stepping on any of their extremities," replied Naruto. Ed, Al, and Rose turned around to see the two white-robed guards knocked out on the ground. They each turned around to inquire about how Naruto had managed to move so fast when a voice rang out across the room. "What is all of this commotion about?" The group looked to the end of the room to see a pair of doors slide open, revealing a man walking down a long set of steps. The man was around 5'8", around his mid to late 50s, and had a bald head. He was also immensely overweight and had a walking cane. He was dressed in the robes of a priest and wore leather sandals. "Damn it. Cray was one of my most devout followers," spoke the man irritated. He looked at the people in the hall. His eyes came upon Rose. "Ah, Rose, my child, how are you this fine day?" asked Cornello, morphing from the irate old man to the kindly priest in the blink of the eye. Rose bowed quickly. "Father Cornello, why did you do this? Why did you order these men killed?" inquired Rose, her voice almost desperate. The father put his hand on his chin before replying. Rose, my child, these men are traitorous heathens who would sow seeds of doubt against our great Lord Leto, spoke Father Cornello, illustrating his actions by thrusting his hand in front and closing his fist quickly, as though he were squashing a fruit of some kind. Now, Rose, my child, pick up that gun and shoot Edward Elric. Ed and Al looked back toward Rose, who had just picked up the gun and was staring at it in fear. She then looked at Ed and slowly lifted the gun before pointing it at him. Good, my child. Know that Leto blesses those who are loyal to him with eternal life and the return of their loved ones, encouraged Cornello. He knew that the girl was putty in his hands once he brought up the resurrection of her beloved deceased boyfriend. Rose, hearing the words of Cornello, looked as though she were about to shoot when she felt a hand on her shoulder. When she looked up, she saw the smiling face of Naruto. She then dropped the gun and fell to her knees, crying, horrified that she was just about to kill another human being. Cornello growled in irritation. His pawn had obviously lost her confidence and was going to be useless. Naruto walked away from the crying Rose before leveling a cold glare at Cornello. You know, Father Cornello, began Naruto, in my past, I've had dealings with many who have manipulated those who were too desperate or too weak-willed to do anything but follow. I highly dislike your kind and personally I would like nothing more than to break your fat neck, but these boys here have some questions they'd like answered. So if you oblige them, I can offer a fitting punishment later. With that said, Naruto walked to the side of the room and leaned against it. Now then, Father Cornello, said Ed, turning away from the crying Rose, I have some questions to ask you. Oh, and what might those be, inquired Cornello, obviously miffed about Rose not killing the Elrics. Now he had to talk his way out the situation diplomatically. Well, like how you are using second-rate alchemy to manipulate your followers, accused Ed. Cornello smiled, almost seeming to adopt a persona at will. What I do is not alchemy, boy. I have merely been touched by the sun god Leto, and he performs his miracles through me. Besides, if what you say is true, how could I be transmuting something more out of something less? Retorted Cornello, smirking as he believed he had stumped the Elric. Yeah, that is what I thought too, explained Ed, but as I started thinking about it, there is one way that you could do it. Ed then pulled out a small notebook, the one that held the ingredients for the average adult. The secret elixir, the red stone, the fifth element, it goes by many names, but each account describes similar effects to what you have been doing here in Lear. My conclusion is that you, Cornello, are in possession of a philosopher's stone. Cornello's eyes bulged before he started stuttering. Ah, that's preposterous. The philosopher's stone is myth, nothing more. It's probably the stone in your ring, the one on your left hand, said Ed, when he saw Cornello's eyes open even wider. Cornello then started laughing wholeheartedly. You really are a prodigy, Edward Elric. Cried out Cornello, madly, but now that you know my secret, I can't possibly let you forlive. As he was saying this, he brought his cane out in front of him and then put it on his shoulder. He placed his left hand on the cane and a red light sprung forth from it. When the light died down, instead of a cane on Cornello's shoulder, there was a large multi-barreled automatic machine gun. A moment later, Cornello pulled the trigger, releasing a continuous volley of bullets that rained down on them all. Even using alchemy, it was all Ed and Al could do to put up a wall of earth before the bullets came. Rose, however, did not have such a luxury. She fell back in surprise and fear. She saw her death coming and mourned the fact that she could not do more with her life. She closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable pain that the bullets would bring. But right before the bullets hit, she felt a pair of arms grasp her. The force hit her body, and she was grateful for the hand that was supporting her, preventing the whiplash. As soon as it came, the force left. She looked around her, not recognizing her surroundings, before realizing that she was in the corridor that they had used to enter the room she had just been in. Rose, said the owner of the hands that were lifting her from the floor by her shoulders. Rose, yelled the voice. At the yell, Rose looked up to see Naruto, breathing very heavily. How die, she stuttered, not being able to comprehend how she was still alive. Rose, listen to me, stated Naruto, urgently. Rose. Yes, she said meekly. Rose, I need you to find a safe place to stay until Ed and he was cut off by a loud boom from the room that they had just exited. He stood up and headed towards the stairs. As he reached the base of the stairs, he turned to Rose. Rose, he called, gaining the girl's attention, make sure you follow my instructions. Find a safe place. You might want to get out of Lear. Things are gonna get pretty hectic soon. With that said, he rushed up the stairs to the church above. Cornello was running back to his office to order everyone in the city to be on the lookout for the traitorous heathens that were the Elric brothers. He opened the door to his office only to find the Fullmetal Alchemist himself sitting on his desk. "WHWH, you infernal little brat. What are you doing in my office?" he asked, furious that the Fullmetal Alchemist was in his office the entire time that he had been looking for them. Look, do you think we can just cut the crap and talk? I just have some questions about the Philosopher's Stone, said Ed, smirking, or maybe you'd like to get the military involved. I bet I could get them to shut down this place real good. Cornello looked absolutely livid but took a deep breath and calmed down, realizing a situation like this doesn't often present itself. He took a look behind him to make sure no one was there before stepping into his office and closing the door. Alright, Fullmetal Alchemist, ask your questions, replied Cornello. Well, you could do anything with the Philosopher's Stone, right? Why waste all your time and power doing petty tricks and phony miracles, inquired Ed. At this, Cornello actually smiled, although it was a smile of satisfaction. The reason I do my miracles is that with each new miracle, I can attract more people to the religion of Ledoism, people who would lay down their lives for my sake. I am slowly building a legion of holy warriors, an army of soldiers unafraid to die. If I continue my miracles, in a few more years I could have enough people in my order that I could wage war upon the world. And I'll use the Philosopher's Stone to destroy this country from the inside out, he let out an evil laugh. It was cut short, however, when Ed started laughing too. Except his was the laugh of someone who just been told a good joke instead of the insane laughter that Cornello produced. What? Why are you laughing? You should be cowering. Cried out Cornello, confused. You know, started Ed, you really are a novice. With that he held up the controller for the citywide broadcast system and pointed to Cornello's left, where a microphone was subtly placed on the floor. Cornello looked at the controller, then looked at the microphone, and then back at the controller, before the message in his mind clicked. His screams of anger were hid throughout the city as he tried and failed to get the broadcasting controller away from Ed. After a moment of struggle, Cornello backed up against the door and yelled, "How long has that been on?" Ed only laughed. The whole time. Your believers heard ever single word. You little brat, you'll pay dearly for this. Cornello lifted his cane up and brought his left hand over to transmute it into a rocket launcher. However, before Cornello could lift the rocket launcher, Ed had already transmuted a knife out of one of the paperweights on the desk and sliced the barrel off of the launcher. Face it, said Ed, backing away from Cornello, you are just outclassed here. Cornello's eyes opened wide in surprise. But he brought his left hand up to the stump of his weapon and began another transmutation. No, you are the one that's outclassed, I am without rival. The stump of the gun started glowing red, like a laser preparing to fire. The light from the transmutation flickered erratically, then imploded. The father's arm melded with the metal of the gun, forming a grotesque mesh of skin and metal. He had a rebound, muttered Ed to himself. He looked upon Cornello, who was now gasping in pain, and for a moment, felt pity. Cornello looked upon Ed, and a new fire sprang back into his eyes. No, he said to himself, no, 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 I shall not be shamed like this, I am without equal. After saying that, he pressed his left hand to his chest, enveloping his entire body in the red alchemical light of the Philosopher's Stone. Ed looked on in abstract horror as Cornello rose in front of him, a massive behemoth of anger and muscle. Without a moment's hesitation, Ed ran between the hulking Cornello's legs and down to the auditorium below. As Ed ran down the stairs to the auditorium, he could hear and feel Cornello coming down the stairs behind him. He reached the doors at the bottom of the stairs and dove left into the auditorium. Not a moment later, the hulking Cornello came bursting through the door and the wall, landing right where Ed would have been had he not dove left. Cornello looked around the auditorium, spotting Ed, who had just gotten up from his dive. Cornello charged Ed, swinging madly. After a few swings, he managed to clip Ed with one of his punches, sending him flying off into one of the pews. Edward Elric, came out the mutated voice of Cornello, God has deemed you to be unholy. As the fist of God, it is my duty to destroy you heathen. Cornello smashed his fist down, but Ed rolled out of the way and hopped up. He ran over to the large statue of Leto in the center of the auditorium. He clapped his hands together, then placed them on the base of the statue. If you want the fist of God so much, then you can have it. Blue light engulfed Ed's hands and up on the top of the statue, a hand made of stone launched itself out from the statue and smashed Cornello to the ground. The red light engulfed Cornello. He reverted back to his normal form, albeit still with his mutated right arm. He was crying in pain. Ed walked over to him, grabbed him by the head and punched him in the face. Shut up. Yelled Ed, grabbing Cornello's head again and holding it up so he could look into his eyes. Just tell us where the Philosopher's Stone is. Cornello only whimpered some more, then they both gasped and watched as the supposed Philosopher's Stone that was embedded in Cornello's ring fell out onto the floor. Ed reached down to grab it. The stone cracked, lost its luster and disintegrated into dust. What the hell? Exclaimed Ed, confused. The stone, it's supposed to be perfect material, how did it just break like that? I don't know, please don't hurt me, I'm begging you. I didn't know anything about it, other than that it augmented my alchemy. I didn't know any more. Please, spare me, pleaded Cornello, breaking down into tears. It was a fake, stated Edward, his voice sounding incredibly dead. We went through all that trouble, risked our lives, and for what, a damn fake. Cornello had stopped groveling below Ed and raised his hand like a schoolboy asking a question. So, what about me? He said meekly. I don't care what the hell you do, just leave. Yelled Ed. Cornello did not need a second prompting and quickly crawled out of the auditorium on hands and knees. Ed looked around the auditorium, sighed and headed towards the exit. I guess it's back to square one again, Ed muttered to himself and left to go find his brother. The sun was setting on the city of Lear. Ed had searched the city for Al before returning to the church only to find Al sitting on the steps, waiting for him. Ed had explained all that had happened with Cornello and they were now discussing what to do next. So, Alphonse started, the stone was a fake. Yeah, confirmed Ed, just like that priest. Ed sighed before knocking on Al's armor, a grim reminder that Al did not have a body. I'm sorry Al, for a moment I had actually thought we had found a way to get your body back, apologized Ed hanging his head in self-disappointment. Alphonse was about to reply when they heard the sound of a gun hammer being pulled back. Ed and Al looked to see Rose pointing the gun once again at Ed. Ed, give me the philosopher's stone, stated Rose, the gun shaking in her hands. I'm sorry Rose, but as I was just telling Al here, the stone was a fake, it shattered. You're lying, denied Rose, tears leaking from her eyes, you just want it for yourself, so you can use it on your bodies, and so you can see your mother again. Ed looked shocked before anger overtook it. How do you know about that Rose? Rose's eyes opened in fear at the sheer intensity of the older Elric's stare. Alphonse placed his hand on Ed's shoulder, gaining his attention. Brother, when I was setting up the loudspeaker through the city, she was there. I told of our history and why she can never bring her beloved back to Lee. Liar, you said that the philosopher's stone was an all-powerful item, that it. Shut up, cried out Ed, tears leaking from the edges of his eyes, people don't come back from the dead, Rose, not ever. Rose fell to the ground, crying, muttering about how Father Cornello had told her that if she prayed enough, her beloved would be resurrected. Believing that he could be of no more help to her, Ed walked past Rose. She turned and leapt at Ed, clinging to his red coat. Please, she cried, that hope was all I had left in life. What am I supposed to do now? Ed scoffed before brushed her hand off of his coat and walked down the steps. Please, tell me what to do. Cried out Rose in desperation. Ed stopped on the steps before looking up to watch the sunset. I cannot do that Rose. Each of us has to find our own way in life. You have 2 strong legs, so use them. You are strong enough to make your own path. You don't need anyone to tell you what to do. Ed and Al continued their way on down the steps and headed towards the train station. Cornello looked out of his office window to the riotous crowds below. They had been gathering outside the church since his little speech earlier. That damn brat, all that work for nothing, said Cornello to himself. Oh yes, said a voice from the shadows. Cornello turned and squinted into the darkness, only to see Naruto. Except this Naruto looked more serious, not the carefree Naruto of before. This Naruto looked like a hard-cold killer. I know how it feels to have one's plans completely and utterly ruined, continued Naruto. Cornello narrowed his eyes before growling. You, he said, getting angrier, you helped the Fullmetal brat do all this to me. You're the one responsible, yelled out Cornello, pulling out a small pistol and pointing it at Naruto. But before he could even think about pulling the trigger, Naruto disappeared from view. A moment later, Naruto reappeared in front of Cornello, grasping the priest's head as though it a fruit. Naruto leaned in next to Cornello's ear and whispered. You know when I said earlier about how I really dislike your kind, said Naruto, I lied. I absolutely loathe those like you. But the worst thing is, I used to be just like you. Cornello backed up and looked into Naruto's eyes. There was a brief flash of purple in them. But before he could do anything more than blink, Naruto tore his hand away from Cornello's head. To a normal person, it would have looked like Cornello had just fainted on the spot, but if one were able to see chakra, the spiritual energy that exists in all things, they would have seen something truly terrible. Balled up in Naruto's hand was Cornello's soul. Naruto shivered a little as he closed his fist on the ball, absorbing all that was Cornello into himself. Naruto looked around the room, walked up to Cornello's library and took a couple of books. He then turned toward the corpse of Cornello and did a slight bow, his playful persona showing itself, albeit quite morbidly. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you, Cornello, but I'm afraid I must be off. I have a train ride that I do not want to miss. With that, Naruto walked to the window, opened it and disappeared in a blur of black and red. Moments later a series of eyes and mouths started to appear out of the shadows of the office, all looking at the open window. This is an interesting turn of events, said one of the mouths. Father will wish to hear of this immediately. Then all at once, the eyes and mouths disappeared, leaving the corpse of Cornello as the only thing within the room. Ed looked out of the window of the train car that he shared with Al. The night was inky dark, so he couldn't see much, but there was still a serene feeling in simply watching the darkness slide by. "Brother," stated Al, getting Ed's attention, "do you think Mr. Naruto will be angry that we left him in Lear?" "You know, Al, I don't know, but boy was that guy was a real character," replied Ed, yawning. "Why thank you, Ed. I'll take that as a compliment," rang out the voice of Naruto, next to Ed. Both Ed and Al jumped in surprise before looking to the seat next to Ed, empty not a second ago, that now held the smiling Naruto. "What the hell?" exclaimed Ed, surprised and more than a little wary of the ease in which Naruto had just come into their booth. "Oh come now, Ed," replied Naruto, as that a way to greet a friend. Ed looked incredibly exasperated, not even able to respond. Naruto turned to look at Alphonse before smiling. "At least I know Al is my friend, right Alphonse?" inquired Naruto. Al just laughed before replying, "Yep." Both Naruto and Al laughed some more. Ed smiled at seeing his brother laugh. He then looked at the laughing Naruto before finally sighing and turning to look out at the darkness once more. Sure, he was a little weird and bit exuberant, but that didn't make him bad. "Naruto Uzumaki, I think you and I could be friends," thought Ed, gazing out at the infinite blackness that was the night. For those who remember, Colonel Roy Mustang was a man who prided himself in keeping well informed, having informants in almost every branch of the military, and knowing people who had eyes on the rest. This pride was a byproduct of his ambition to become Fur of Amistris, as well as his upbringing under his foster mother, Chris Mustang, or more well known as Madam Christmas. Mustang himself stood at around 5'8" and was, overall, considered very attractive. He had short, stylishly unkempt black hair and black eyes, which were kept in a perpetual piercing stare. The blue uniform of the military was his choice of dress whilst on the job, and the majority of the time he was off of his job as well. The comforting feel of the blue fabric that had seen him through his time in the Ishvalan War of Extermination gave him a sense of security that was oftentimes needed in his line of work. In addition to his uniform, he wore a pair of white gloves that held the transmutation circle for his specific brand of alchemy, flame alchemy. Roy also held the position of state alchemist, bearing the title of the Flame Alchemist. Currently Roy was sitting in office in Eastern Command, the military headquarters of East City. He was leaning back, feeling exasperated. He had just had one of the most confusing conversations of his life. "Well done with the Lear case, Ed. I'm glad that you could resolve that matter on your own," commended Roy, sighing. Ed hadn't even saluted when he finished his report, instead slouching into a seat on the couch in Roy's office. Ed looked over at Roy before shrugging and leaning his head back. "Well, we didn't really do it for you," stated Ed. Mustang shrugged an "oh well" before looking over at the man the Elrics had brought with them, who was sitting on the couch next to Al. The man was strange. He had an air about him that made Roy feel on edge. It was this sixth sense that he had developed during the Ishvalan War, and he was not about to dismiss it now. He felt as if he were in the presence of a predator. Roy turned away from the man, returning his gaze to the elder Elric. "You mentioned that Cornello had a stone that augmented his power. Was it the stone?" "Unfortunately not, the stone was a fake. It gave Cornello increased power and led me to believe it was real. I thought it was real all the way up until his alchemy rebounded. The rebound was so intense that it completely mutilated his arm and the majority of his torso. Soon after, though, the stone disintegrated," stated Ed, sounding depressed. "Before the rebound, however, Cornello could do some amazing things, even with an incomplete stone. Yeah, we saw him transmute a tiny flower that couldn't have weighed more than a 50-cent coin into a massive bejeweled metal rose," exclaimed Al, sounding infinitely more excited than his depressed brother. Ed nodded before sighing once again. "It makes you think of how powerful the real stone must be." Roy nodded in agreement before looking at the odd man again. Throughout the entire report, the man hadn't said anything, instead reading a small orange leather-bound book. Ed noticed Roy's gaze before sighing and gesturing over to Naruto. "Mustang, this is Naruto Uzumaki. He helped rescue a civilian who had been with us when Cornello assaulted Al and me." Ed then closed his eyes, looking down at the ground in depression. "He also saved my life, albeit through the death of another." Roy looked at Naruto, who by now had shut his book and slipped it back inside his coat. "I guess I must thank you, Mr. Uzumaki," said Roy. "We might miss Ed if he was gone." Naruto just waved his hand, smiling. "I just did what any person would have done." Mustang med before leaning forward and studying Naruto's face. "Pardon my asking, but have we ever met? You seem very familiar." Naruto smiled before barking out a small laugh. "No, we have not met, at least not directly," replied Naruto. Everyone in the room looked at Naruto, confused. "What do you mean not directly?" inquired Mustang, slightly annoyed at Naruto's cryptic answer. "Well, I have been working with Christmas since the beginning. I am guessing you probably saw me with her back when she was low on staff," said Naruto. When Naruto mentioned Christmas, Mustang's eyes hardened. Not many people knew of Mustang's connection with Madame Christmas, and he liked to keep it that way. I am afraid that I don't know what you are talking about. Perhaps you are thinking of someone else, replied Roy, subtly taking his left hand off of his desk and slipping it into his coat pocket. Naruto looked at Roy pointedly before shrugging and pulling out his book. Perhaps, he said. Roy reached into his desk and pulled out a folder, placing it on top of his desk. He looked at Ed, who got up and retrieved it before returning to his seat on the couch. Ed opened the first page of the folder to reveal a picture of a middle-aged man with brown hair, wire-framed glasses and a very friendly smile. Above the picture was the name Shu Tucker. "Who is this?" inquired Ed. "Shu Tucker," replied Mustang, one of East City's most renowned bioalchemists. He earned his state alchemist's watch and the title of Sowing Life Alchemist when he successfully transmuted the first speaking chimera. "Wait!" shouted out Ed, standing up and looking at Roy surprised. "Are you saying that Tucker transmuted a chimera that could speak English?" Roy sighed before nodding. "Supposedly, the chimera only said one thing while it was alive," informed Roy. "I want to die," then it didn't eat or drink until it got its wish. Ed looked down at the picture directly below Tucker's, which showed a hideous-looking chimera that looked like the demonic spawn of a monkey and a dog. Ed remained silent as he read the rest of the document on Tucker and his research into bioalchemy. "I don't know much about him. But he is probably your best shot at finding out how Cornello transmuted organic material into inorganic material." Ed nodded, shutting the folder and handing it back to Mustang. "I'll have one of my men come and give you and your brother a ride over to Tucker's house," stated Roy, picking up the phone that was on his desk and dialing a number. "Wait, what are you playing at?" cried out Ed, standing up abruptly and pointing an accusing finger at Roy. Roy gripped the phone firmly, looking thoroughly annoyed. "I'm not playing at anything, Elric," replied Roy, "this is just a thanks for your work in Lear." Then he muttered more to himself than to Ed, "It's better than being in your debt in any case." Roy then continued spinning the dial on the phone, calling down to the front desk of Eastern Command and requesting transportation for the Elric brothers. "I will come to Tucker's house at the end of the week. Have a report ready for me detailing any discoveries you make. Until then, you're dismissed," commanded Roy. Ed stood up and saluted Roy before turning to leave. "Come on Al, we should get going," stated Ed before turning to Naruto. "Will you be coming with us, Mr. Naruto?" Naruto nodded, standing up and turning to the colonel. He bowed his head in farewell, then placed his conical hat on his head. He turned to Ed, who had started toward the door. "Just a moment, I would like to have a word in private with Mr. Uzumaki," stated Roy, halting the group. Naruto turned around and looked at Roy before shrugging. "You go on ahead Ed, I'll catch up with you guys." Naruto then walked up to Roy's desk, pulled out the chair that was in front of it and sat down, placing his conical hat on his lap. Ed looked at Roy, who waved him away. Ed frowned slightly before turning to his brother. "Come on Al, let's get going." Ed turned and walked out of the room, his brother quickly following behind him. When the door closed, Roy stood up abruptly, baring his gloved left hand at Naruto. "How do you know of my connections to Madame Christmas?" inquired Roy firmly, looking at Naruto with cold eyes. "As I said, I used to work with her in the beginning," replied Naruto. "Do not test me, Mr. Uzumaki," yelled out Mustang, "I know Christmas. She never employs men. She considers them too unreliable." Naruto chuckled, looking at Roy amused. "I suppose you tried to work for her before you apprenticed under Hawkeye." Mustang snapped his fingers, sending a small funnel of flame launching from his fingertips toward Naruto. The flame did not actually reach Naruto, instead fizzling out about a quarter-inch away from his face. Naruto looked unfazed, just waving his hand to remove the smell of burnt ozone. "So, that is how you do it," stated Naruto, making Mustang narrow his eyes. "You don't actually create flames using alchemy, do you?" Mustang's eyes widened. "You lower the density of the air, splitting the major elements from it. You then separate any carbon from the local carbon monoxide and use your gloves to create a spark that ignites the carbon. With mass amounts of pure oxygen to fuel the fire, you could create an inferno with relative ease. The best part is that the denser air around the flame acts as an amazing insulator, keeping it under your control." Naruto then shook his head before breathing out, "It's really quite ingenious." Mustang was completely astounded and a little frightened. This man had just deciphered in no time flat the alchemy that had taken Mustang's master an entire lifetime to create and Mustang's adolescence to perfect. Mustang backed up, sitting hard into his chair. Naruto on the other hand chuckled, then stood up and placed his conical hat in his head. "Who are you?" asked Mustang, still unable to believe that Naruto had been able to decipher his alchemy. Naruto stopped and turned around, smiling. "I'm just a traveling historian who has a knack for writing," replied Naruto. With that said, Naruto raised his hand in farewell, turned around and left the office. Flashback end. Mustang was shaken from his thoughts by a knock on the door. He straightened in his seat and slipped the glove off his hand, placing it into his pocket. "Come in," said Roy in a commanding voice. The door to his office opened and in walked a blonde woman dressed in the garb of the military. She walked up to Roy's desk before snapping a salute. "Eddie's Hawkeye." Mustang looked at the woman for a moment, watching as she brought her hand down from a salute, then put both hands loosely behind her back. Lieutenant Riza Hawkeye was a strong woman. She had joined the military at the age of 19 and had never looked back. Since the beginning of her career, she had been under the command of Roy Mustang, later on becoming his adjutant. She was muscular for a woman, although not grotesquely so, as she still retained all of her womanly appeal. She stood at 5'7" and wore her long blonde hair bound up and in a hair clip, which caused her hair to look somewhat reminiscent of the tail feathers of a bird. The hair that was not in the hair clip was slicked to the side of her head, giving her an almost tomboyish appearance. This was only accentuated by the blue military uniform that she wore. "Sir, the Elrics and Mr. Uzumaki have left the building and are on their way to Mr. Tucker's estate," informed Riza. "Thank you," said Mustang. He then reached into his desk and pulled out his alchemist's watch. "Riza, I need you to go to East Library and find any records regarding Mr. Uzumaki." He handed Riza the watch. She nodded before saluting and leaving the office. After the door to the office closed, Mustang grabbed his phone and spun the dial on it. He placed the receiver to his ear, listening to the ringing of the phone. A moment later, the sound of someone picking up the phone came through and a female voice sounded from the other side. "This is Roy Mustang," spoke out Mustang. After a moment he smiled and leaned back in his chair. "Yes, this is really me. I would like to speak with Madam Christmas." "Wow!" exclaimed Ed, "this place is huge." Ed, Al, and Naruto were walking up to one of the largest houses in East City, belonging to the acclaimed alchemist Shu Tucker. The house had one main building, with two extensions flanking either side. After a few seconds, the trio reached the front doors of the mansion. The house could be nothing less. Ed walked forward and grasped the large brass door knocker and slammed it 3 times against the oak of the door. After knocking, Ed stepped back to wait. When it became apparent that no one had heard the knock, Ed stepped forward and reached out to grab the knocker again. While Ed was doing that, however, Naruto noticed a sound come rushing up from behind him. Naruto dodged on instinct, stepping to the side and crouching, evading his assailant, which just happened to be a massive white dog. It also just happened that instead of pouncing on Naruto, the dog collided with Ed and sent him careening into the floor. "Ah! Get it off me!" cried out Ed, struggling to get out from under the large dog. Al and Naruto bent down to try and get Ed out from under the dog when a childish laugh drew their attention elsewhere. At the entrance to the property were a little girl, who was the one laughing, and her father Shu Tucker. "Look, Daddy!" cried out the little girl, "we have company." Tucker looked at the group sheepishly as he walked up to them, hand in hand with his daughter. Tucker was a lanky man of average height whose hair had receded, leaving a small tuft at the top. He had a somewhat gaunt face and wore a pair of wire-framed spectacles. He also perpetually wore a small smile on his face. He had on khaki pants and a black undershirt with a green dress shirt over it. Tucker's daughter, on the other hand, was a small sweet-looking girl who couldn't be more than 5 or 6. She had her father's brown hair, which was worn in a braid down her back. She also had deep blue eyes, which showed nothing but the innocence of a child. Nina wore a small red shirt and blue shorts. "This is why we keep the dog leashed," Nina admonished Tucker, grasping the dog by the collar and pulling. When the dog was off, Ed got up and brushed his coat off, looking very annoyed. Naruto and Al's chuckling behind him wasn't helping his situation either. "I'm sorry about Alexander," apologized Tucker, who walked forward and pulled out a small key to unlock the oak doors. "He has a habit of jumping up on people that he hasn't met." Tucker then placed his daughter on Alexander's back and opened the front doors, leading the dog inside. When both Alexander and Nina were inside the house, Tucker closed the door and turned to address the three. "Now then, I believe introductions are in order," stated Tucker, reaching into his shirt and revealing a large silver watch. "I am Shu Tucker, the Sewing Life Alchemist." In response, Ed stepped forward, reached into his coat and pulled out an identical watch. "I am Edward Elric, the Fullmetal Alchemist." Ed then extended his hand, which was grasped by Tucker. "It's a pleasure to meet such an acclaimed bioalchemist as yourself, Mr. Tucker." "Likewise," replied Tucker. Tucker then looked at Al before extending his hand. "I'm Alphonse Elric," stated Al, grabbing Tucker's hand. Tucker nodded before turning toward Naruto. "I'm Naruto Uzumaki," said Naruto, extending his hand. Tucker looked at Naruto for a moment before grasping his hand. "If I may ask, Mr. Uzumaki, what do you do for a living?" inquired Tucker. "Well, I'm a traveling historian," stated Naruto. He then pulled out a small orange book and handed it to Tucker. "I also happen to be a writer. This is a copy of my first book." Tucker looked at the title, Make Out Paradise. before shrugging and flipping a few pages into the book. After a few minutes, he slowly grew red before letting out a chuckle. Tucker then handed the book back to Naruto, who refused to take it. "Keep it as my sample book." Tucker nodded before tucking, no pun intended, the book into his back pocket. He then turned around and opened the door, entering his house and gesturing for the trio to come in. They followed Tucker through what seemed to be a hallway that went straight through the entire house. Many doors lined this hallway, but most were closed and somewhat dusty. At the end of the hallway was a split stairway that led both right and left, although the left one was blocked by yellow caution tape. Tucker turned slightly towards them, once again looking sheepish. "Sorry that the place looks so rough. My wife left Nina and me 3 years ago, and I just haven't been really able to clean the place since." Tucker gestured to the obvious dust and sparse pieces of trash that lined the hallway. After Tucker said that, Ed and Al crept up next to Naruto. "Why didn't you tell us you are a writer?" whispered Ed. "What do you write about?" inquired Al, whispering as well. "Well," started Naruto, pulling out another orange book, "why don't you take a look? But be warned, it's not for everybody." Ed grasped the book, turning a few pages, his brother leaning down to look over his shoulder. After a few minutes of reading, however, the brothers began blushing, or in Al's case, looking as flustered as possible. Not a moment later, Ed tossed the book down onto the ground. "What the hell is this trash?" cried out Ed, backing away from the book comically, as if it were the very spawn of Satan himself. Tucker, who was in front of them and had been completely oblivious to the conversation occurring behind him, turned around and looked at Ed with confusion. "What seems to be the problem?" inquired Tucker, looking to Naruto for answers. But he only found Naruto bent over, laughing at the elder Elric's reaction. He then looked to Al, but Al was just standing frozen in place, his 11-year-old mind still contemplating what he just read. Naruto stopped laughing after a few minutes and bent down to pick up the copy of his book. After seeing the book, Tucker placed the pieces together and figured out the situation. He walked up to Al and knocked on his armor a few times to snap him out of his reverie. Ed looked at Naruto with distaste. Naruto looked at Ed before shrugging, "Hey, a man has got to make money somehow. It just so happens that the market for my style of literature has little competition and lots of profit." Ed looked at Naruto sourly before shaking his head and looking toward Tucker, who had successfully revived Al. Tucker glanced at the two Elrics, then turned and continued leading them down the hallway. After a few minutes, he turned left, opened one of the numerous doors of the estate, and entered his living room. Said room had a long table in the center but was surprisingly small, given the size of the rest of the estate. Tucker gave the trio a seat before leaving to get some tea for them all. He returned to a tense silence amongst the trio. Ed was staring harshly at Naruto, Naruto was smiling at Ed, and Al was sitting with a large blush on his face, once again, metaphorical blush. Tucker coughed, gaining their attention, before walking up to the table and placing a tray of tea in the center. After that, Tucker took a seat across from the three and laced his hands in front of his face, giving them a contemplative look. "So, Ed, why are you here? Mustang said you had an interest in bioalchemy," inquired Tucker, taking a sip of his tea. "Well, the reason we are here is somewhat personal," replied Ed, a sad note entering his voice. "Ed," began Tucker, "I am willing to share all that I know, but you need to do the same. That is the rule that we alchemists live by after all. Equivalent exchange." "Brother," stated Al, worry lacing his voice. Ed held up his hand to silence his brother. "It's all right, Al," replied Ed, locking eyes with Tucker. "Mr. Tucker, I must ask that you keep this between the four of us. What I tell you must not leave this room." Ed then sent an inquiring gaze at Naruto, who nodded. "Okay," stated Ed to himself, getting out of his seat. After that, he grasped the white glove on his right hand, lifting it off to reveal a metal automail hand. Automail is an advanced prosthetic, much more maneuverable than wood and in many ways superior to their fleshy counterparts. Ed then grabbed his red coat, stripping it off his torso and revealing the black undershirt he wore and a completely metal arm. Tucker's and Naruto's eyes were very wide open, surprised at seeing one as young as Ed have such extensive automail. Al, on the other hand, was looking down into his tea, sadness emanating from his body. Ed pulled the chair out from the table, putting his left leg onto the table and pulling up his pant leg, revealing even more automail. Ed then slid down his pant leg before putting his jacket back on and sitting back down. He leaned his head down and put his hands on his forehead before sighing, "We were 8 years old when our mother grew ill. She caught one of the plagues that swept the country during the Ishvalan War. At the time, we had just started learning alchemy and had found out how powerful it could be." Ed's face grew shadowed as his thoughts became darker. "We lived in a small village to the south and our only doctor had been called out to the war. She died that December. After her death, Al and I thrust ourselves into our studies. In fact, I think it was only our studies that allowed us to endure the aftermath of her death. In the summer of 1908, we found a skilled alchemist who agreed to be our teacher. Ed stopped for a moment, stirring his tea slowly and sighing. We didn't know, stated Al, sadness lacing his voice, we just wanted to see our mother again. Tucker placed his hand on his chin, frowning. Human transmutation, stated Tucker, taking a sip of his tea, the one taboo. Ed nodded, sighing. That summer, we attempted human transmutation. Wait, interjected Naruto, giving Ed a harsh glare, you attempted to bring the dead back to life. Ed looked down, before nodding, yes. Naruto shuddered, before looking down, placing his face into his hands and sighing. What were the results? Inquired Naruto. Tucker leaned forward in his chair, eager to hear Ed's response. Complete failure, replied Ed. At that, Tucker's eyes lost some of their sparkle, and Naruto let out another sigh. When it was all settled and done, our result didn't even look human. And there was a great price for even that deformed corpse. I lost my arm and leg and Al lost his entire body. I see, replied Tucker, draining his teacup in the process. Ed, I thank you for sharing your story. I really don't have much that I can offer that will help. But why don't you take a look at my laboratory? Tucker then got up and left the living room, once again entering the large hallway. He turned right, heading toward the front door and walked until he reached a large set of heavy double doors. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, which he used to unlock the doors. Be prepared, they get a little jittery around new people, stated Tucker, turning toward the trio, who had followed him out of the living room. Then he pushed open the double doors, filling the hallway with the screeching of the multitudes of chimeras contained inside Tucker's laboratory. Tucker walked inside, reaching to his left as he did, flipping on a light switch and illuminating the room. Lining all the walls in the laboratory were over 100 cages filled with various chimera. The only place that was not occupied by a cage was a space at the back of the room that contained an old desk. Some of the chimeras were very small, being no larger than a mouse, while the biggest was a chimp that was near the desk. Although the chimeras looked vastly different from each other, they all shared one characteristic that set the group on edge, Naruto in particularly. The chimeras, no matter what they were, all appeared completely and utterly unnatural. Tucker walked to the desk in the back of the room and pulled out a clipboard and pencil. He then turned around and looked at the group, who was still standing in the doorway of his laboratory, and gestured for them to come in. The trio entered and began studying the different creatures. If I may ask, began Ed, gaining Tucker's attention, how does one create a chimera? I've looked into it, but I have never actually found a straight answer. Well, began Tucker, putting his hand up to his chin, I guess the textbook definition would be the combining of one or more dissimilar organisms through alchemy, creating a new organism that usually has the attributes of its component parts, although that is at the alchemist's discretion. The technique generally used by bioalchemists involves placing the component subjects on two or more separate transmutation arrays and breaking down the organism into its cellular units before using the cells to then, in essence, build a completely new being. However, that technique has quite a few flaws, first among them being the fact that the alchemist performing the transmutation needs to know the exact anatomy of the organisms. This leads to specialization, where a bioalchemist will spend his entire life focusing on the physique of specific organisms, limiting the options the alchemist has on what he can create. Another byproduct of dissolving an organism is that it loses all knowledge of its previous self. I cannot tell you how many great bioalchemists died because the chimera panicked in its new environment. Ed nodded in comprehension, before looking around himself and seeing the vast diversity in the chimeras inside the laboratory. Ed was about to question Tucker again, but his brother beat him to it. You must use a different technique then, stated Al, gesturing to all the different types of chimeras around them. Tucker nodded. You would be correct, Alphonse. My technique works around both of these problems. Instead of dissolving the component organisms into their cellular state and manipulating their creation from there, I put them into one array and merge them directly, letting their own anatomies decide where they should place themselves. Ed's eyes opened in surprise when Tucker said this. That's insane. Cried out Ed, that's like having two trains crash into each other and hoping that they make a bigger train. Tucker shrugged. Well, I must admit that my way transmuting does not have as much finesse as the one that is generally used by the state. It does work around both of the major problems that have plagued bioalchemists since Amistrus's conception, and is the only method that has yet to produce a known speaking chimera. I guess, replied Ed, shaking his head, before turning back to the rabbit-dog hybrid creature that he had been looking at prior to the conversation. Tucker just shrugged, before walking up to a cage near his desk, one that contained a chimp. Tucker knelt down so that he was at the chimp's eye level. He held up his hand and got the chimp's attention, before moving his hands in some form of sign language. The chimp apparently seemed to understand Tucker, signing back to him. Tucker smiled, then signed some more, before placing his hands on his lips. The chimp looked confused, then it started screeching very loudly, hurting the group's ears and agitating the other animals in the room. Soon the room was a cacophony of noise worse than when they had initially entered, as all the animals joined the chimp. The noise got so loud that the group was forced to leave. After Tucker closed the doors, the sound died down substantially. Tucker relocked the room before sighing and leaning against the door. He sighed again, reaching up and rubbing the back of his head, almost as if in defeat. "You know, Ed," began Tucker, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "despite my clunky way of transmutation, I am regarded as one of the leading bioalchemists in Amistris. But in truth, I haven't actually accomplished much since my initial talking chimera, and I have never even been able to recreate it. That is one of the major rules of science, the ability to recreate one's experiment so that others may critically analyze it." Tucker sniffled and almost looked as if he were going to cry. Al leaned down and put his hand on Tucker's shoulder, patting it reassuringly. "You can do it, Mr. Tucker," stated Al, "I know it. After all, anything can be created again once we know it can be done in the first place." Tucker looked down, before looking up and smiling slightly. "Thanks, Al." Tucker then leaned off the door, before turning down the hallway, this time toward the staircase. "Come on, I have one more thing to show you guys." He turned right up the stairway and led them to another hallway, although this one was much shorter than the previous. Tucker walked all the way down to the end, where a pair of heavy oak doors were located, looking much like the oak doors to Tucker's laboratory. Tucker walked up to the doors, turning to look at the group behind him, before opening them to reveal a room almost completely filled with tall bookshelves packed with books. "Wow!" exclaimed Ed and Al together, gazing at the library in awe. Naruto looked at the collection, nodding in appreciation. "This is quite the collection, Mr. Tucker. It must have taken you a while to collect." "Yes, although most of it is actually my previous teacher's collection. I have just been adding to it when I can." Tucker then turned toward the brothers and pointed to one of the nearer bookshelves. "Those shelves contain all of my research, the rest of the books are the collective works of several great bioalchemists, as well as some of the more advanced theories on alchemy itself. You are free to read as you like. If you need anything, I will be down the hall in my study." Tucker turned and left, going down the hall and entering what was, presumably, his study. Ed nodded, before rushing towards the nearest book he could get his hands on. "Al, I've got this shelf," stated Ed, pulling out a thick tome and opening it, then sitting down on the floor. Al walked over to the shelf with Tucker's notes on it. "I've got this shelf, brother," replied Al, pulling out the first in a number of books containing Tucker's research. Naruto, on the other hand, just stood in the doorway, watching as the brothers slowly immersed themselves in the world of alchemy. After a while, Naruto grew bored and stretched, then waved to the unresponsive duo. "I'm gonna go do something, see you guys later." Naruto then turned around and started walking down the hallway, not waiting for a response he knew would come. Naruto walked down the stairs and made his way towards the house's exit, but stopped when he heard childish laughter coming from the living room. He opened the door and chuckled at what he saw. The little girl, Nina, Tucker's child, was riding her large dog Alexander like a horse all around the living room. She stopped, however, when she heard Naruto's chuckle. She looked at Naruto for a moment, confused, before laughing and riding Alexander over to Naruto. She rode right up until she was directly in front of Naruto, before looking up at him. "Who are you?" she inquired. "Well," Naruto thought for a moment, before a smile engulfed his face. "This is for you, sensei," he thought. "I go by many names, I am the wandering sage, the paragon of perverts everywhere, loved by women and feared by all else, I am Naruto Uzumaki." While he was saying this, Naruto started doing a kabuki dance that flowed along with his words. Nina, on the other hand, became even more confused. "Okay, well, Mr. Sage Man, can you play with me?" inquired Nina, albeit a little hesitantly. Naruto gave a gentle smile, before nodding and kneeling down, so that he and Nina were eye level. "So, what do you want to play?" Nina looked at Naruto confused, before tilting her head to the side in a thinking pose, making her look extremely adorable. "I don't really know, normally I just play with Alexander," replied Nina, looking dejected. Naruto chuckled, before rubbing her head. "Well, Nina, I know a game we could play." Nina looked up, extremely happy that Naruto would still play with her, despite the fact that she did not think of a game. "What is it?" exclaimed Nina. Naruto laughed wholeheartedly at her eagerness, before standing up. "Where I come from, kids play a game called Ninja." Naruto started to walk towards the front door, Nina following along and listening to Naruto's explanation of the game. One person, the ninja, hides as best as he can, while the others try to capture him. If the ninja captures a pursuer, however, that pursuer is dead and cannot let the other pursuers know where the ninja is. The game is over when the ninja has outlasted the pursuers successfully capture the ninja, or the ninja successfully captures all the pursuers. Naruto opened the front door and led Nina outside. He walked to the middle of the yard before turning and looking down. "Did you get all that?" asked Naruto. Nina looked at Naruto, once again confused, before nodding slowly. It's just like hide and seek, but with tag. Naruto laughed at the girl's simple explanation, before nodding. Something like that. An Alexander play? Inquired Nina, looking up at Naruto impishly. Naruto nodded, and Nina laughed childishly. Now Nina, I am going to count to 60. You and Alexander hide or try to set up any traps for me. But that said, Naruto sat down and leaned back onto the grass, closed his eyes and began counting to 60. Naruto and Nina were next to each other, lying on their backs. They had just spent the last 3 hours playing, and Nina was now quite exhausted and decided to rest. Nina is pretty good, thought Naruto, she could have competed with kids from my time. Naruto turned to look at Nina, who was playing with Alexander's great ears and laughing whenever the dog would turn to lick her. So, did you have fun, Nina? Inquired Naruto. The little girl just smiled, before nodding vigorously. Yes. I am going to show daddy that game. Then he will have to play with me. Naruto's smile dimmed as he heard the forlorn sound in the girl's voice. I guess Mr. Tucker doesn't spend a lot of time with you. Nina nodded, curling up on her side and hugging one of Alexander's large paws. He spends most of his time up in his study. But that's okay, because daddy is working hard on his alchemy, and that is what is important. Naruto frowned, not liking the sound of that. He turned away from Nina and looked into the sky, watching as its colors turned red as the day started coming to an end. He turned back to Nina, watching as she slowly stroked Alexander's fur and hugged him, looking sad as she did so. Hey, Nina, began Naruto, gaining Nina's attention, how about we go on inside and check out the Elric brothers? Nina looked at Naruto, once again confused, just as she had been many times earlier that day. Naruto got the hint and sat up, before explaining. The Elric brothers are the 2 people that came with me. Nina then nodded, before smiling. Do you think they'll play ninja with us? Inquired Nina, climbing onto Alexander's back. Naruto only shrugged, before heading toward the house. Let's go find out. Wow, whispered Nina, they've read so many books. Naruto nodded in agreement. At the moment, both he and Nina were looking around the corner of the doorway into the library. The two had decided to try to prank the brothers. However, the brothers were so immersed in their books that setting up a prank wouldn't even be a challenge. Ed and Al were sitting on opposite sides of the library, each having their own small mountain of books surrounding them. Naruto looked down at Nina, before whispering something in her ear. She let out a small giggle, before climbing onto Alexander's back and entering the library, skirting around its edge. Naruto waited for a moment, before entering and walking up to Ed, who was still too immersed in his book to even notice Naruto. Naruto reached down and plucked the book out of Ed's hands, before lifting it high in the air, out of Ed's reach. Ed just sat there for a moment, not computing what just happened, before looking up at Naruto, who was smirking. Ed leapt up and tried to get the book out of Naruto's hands, but Naruto just raised it higher. What the hell? Give me back my book, damn it. Ed clapped his hands together and was about to place them on the floor when a shadow appeared over him. He looked up just in time to see Nina riding Alexander, who then proceeded to land on him, pinning him under the great dog's weight. Ed struggled a little bit, eventually able to get his head out far enough to look up at Naruto, who was struggling not to laugh. Naruto, what the hell? Wheezed out Ed. By this time, Al had gotten up from his reading and walked over to stand next to Naruto. Al, unlike Naruto, was laughing quite hard at his brother's misfortune. I don't know, Ed. What are you asking? Inquired Naruto, quite amused. Ed looked up at Naruto murderously, before trying to get out from under the dog. Naruto chuckled and patted Nina on the head. Nina, I think Ed has been bullied enough. Nina laughed, before nudging Alexander forward, moving the great dog off of Ed. Once he was able, Ed leapt up and lunged for Naruto. Naruto sidestepped Ed, grabbing him around the waist as he did to prevent the Elric from crashing into one of the numerous bookshelves. Come on, Ed, you gotta look at your surroundings before making decisions, chided Naruto. Ed looked up at Naruto, even more annoyance in his eyes than before. You could have seriously messed up Mr. Tucker's library. Whatever, Naruto. Could you put me down? Asked Ed. Naruto chuckled, before placing Ed down. Ed looked at Naruto, annoyed, before walking over to Al and leaning on his brother's metal body. So, Naruto, what do you want? Inquired Ed. Naruto looked at Ed, before reaching his hand down and patting Nina on the head, who just laughed. Well, Nina, why don't you tell Ed what you were thinking? Nina looked up at Naruto, before looking at Ed. She got off of Alexander, walked up to Ed, and bowed. Mr. Ed, Mr. Al, could you play ninja with us? Ed looked down at Nina, then looked up at Naruto, confused. What is ninja? Inquired Al. Naruto smiled, before crossing his arms. Why don't you join us and find out? Said Naruto. Ed frowned, before kneeling down and grabbing Nina's shoulders. I'm sorry, Nina, but we didn't come here to. Nina didn't wait for Ed to finish, instead rushing back to Alexander and hopping onto his back. She urged Alexander forward, and before Ed could do anything, he found himself pinned once again under the great dog. "Ah!" cried out Ed, "what the hell? Get it off me." Nina shook her head, looking down at Ed and sticking her tongue out. "Not until you say you'll play with me." Ed looked up at Nina indignantly, he then looked up at Naruto when he heard him chuckling. "She's running a hard case, Chief," said Naruto. Ed sighed in defeat, okay, I guess Al and I can play with you." "And Alexander," interjected Nina. "And Alexander, for a while, but then we'll really need to get back to work." "Yeah," cried out Nina in joy. She urged Alexander off Ed. As Ed was getting up however, there was a knock on the door of the library. The door opened to reveal a tall blond man in military garb. He was flanked by Mr. Tucker, who was smiling bashfully. "Hey, Chief," spoke out the blond man, "what are you doing down there?" "I was taking a break from a long day of research I guess," replied Ed, brushing the great dog's hair off his pants. "Well, your ride is here," said the blond man. Ed looked up at the blond man, before sighing and turning towards Nina. "Sorry Nina, I guess we'll have to play another time," said Ed. Nina looked dejected, but nodded. "Don't worry Nina," spoke Tucker, "Ed and Al are coming back tomorrow to continue their research." Nina's face lit up in happiness as she heard that, before running up to Naruto and looking up at him. "You are going to come back too, right?" Naruto laughed, before smiling and nodding. Nina jumped up in joy and ran to Mr. Tucker, who picked her up and placed her on his shoulder. "Come on you four," spoke Tucker, turning and heading down the hallway, "I'll walk you out." They followed Tucker to the front door, where Tucker stepped aside and let them walk past. He waved them through and was about to close the door when the blond man seemed to remember something. He turned around and addressed Tucker. "By the way, the colonel wanted me to remind you that examination day is in a week. Good luck." With that said, the blond man turned and made his way toward the car that would drive the Elrics and Naruto to their lodgings for the night. "Daddy," rang out Nina's voice from Tucker's shoulder, "what is examination day?" "Well," replied Tucker, closing the front door, "every year, state alchemists have to report on their research if they wish to keep their certification. Daddy did not do so well last year, so this year I have to provide something extraordinary, or else your daddy will not be a state alchemist anymore." Tucker then felt Nina's arms wrap around his head and hug him. "You can do it Daddy, I know you can, you're always studying so hard." Tucker took Nina from her place on his shoulders and embraced her in a tight hug. "You're right Nina. I just have to try harder." Tucker then closed his eyes and let a single tear fall. "So, Nina, is it just you and your dad who live here?" inquired Al, flipping the page of his book. "Yeah, Daddy said that I have a mommy, but she left 3 years ago," replied Nina. She was sitting with her back to Alexander, who was curled protectively around her. "It must be pretty lonely around here then," said Naruto, who was sitting with his back leaned against Al. He was writing in a notebook, putting his pencil up to his mouth every so often to think. The notebook's title was Research. "Well, lately Daddy has been in study a lot, but it's okay, I have Alexander." "I guess I am a little lonely though," replied Nina, her voice going somber near the end of her reply. The group became quiet, thinking about what Nina had said. A moment later, Ed snapped his book shut before standing up and stretching. "My shoulders are absolutely killing me," complained Ed, rubbing his right shoulder with his hand. "Perhaps you should move around brother," suggested Al, closing his book as well. "Yeah, you're right. Hey you," cried out Ed, pointing at Naruto, "I need to get you back for pranking me the other day." Naruto chuckled before slipping his pencil and notebook into his coat. "Is that a challenge Ed?" inquired Naruto, getting a competitive look on his face. "Hell, yeah." Naruto smiled before turning to Nina. "So, Nina, how should we settle our dispute?" Nina got a blank look on her face before slowly smiling and giving a joyous laugh. "Let's play ninja," she cried out, mounting Alexander and riding him out of the library. Ed and Al looked at Naruto confused. "What is ninja?" inquired the brothers simultaneously. Naruto laughed before making his way out of library. "Well, you have 30 minutes. Ed exhaled slowly, trying to keep the noise he was making to a minimum. He was currently located very high in one of the many trees on Tucker's property. He was attempting to hide from the searching eyes of the freakishly observant Naruto, going so far as to even transmute the color of his jacket from red to green and cover his face with green paint. After nearly 30 minutes of not being found, Ed moved out near the edge of the branch and looked down just to be sure that he wasn't found. He then let out a sigh of relief when he didn't see anybody climbing. He leaned back, wanting to wait out his last few moments of hiding in silent celebration. He was surprised however when he felt something soft instead of the hard bark of the tree that he was expecting. "Ooh," Ed's eyes widened in shock as he let out a yell of frustration before flailing about and nearly falling out of the tree. Ed turned around to see Naruto on an adjacent branch. The soft thing Ed had leaned back onto was Naruto's jacket, which he had spread across the branches and was laying his head in to rest. "What the hell, Naruto?" cried out Ed, thrusting his hands up in frustration. This, however, caused Ed to overbalance and fall backwards. Right as Ed was about fall, however, Naruto's hand streaked forward and grabbed Ed by his shirt collar, pulling him back up to safety. "Come on, Ed, what have I been saying for the last week?" chided Naruto. Ed sighed before rolling his eyes. "Be aware of my surroundings," recited Ed, mechanically. Ed then looked at Naruto with a wary eye before leaning forward and putting his chin on his hand. "How'd you find me this time?" Naruto smiled before leaning back smugly. "You transmuted your jacket under the same tree you were hiding in," said Naruto. Ed groaned in frustration before shaking his head. "So, did you find the others?" Naruto nodded. "Yeah, I found Al about 8 minutes in, and I found Nina around the 20-minute mark." Ed smirked, happy that at least he was the last to be found. "So, I won." Naruto barked out a laugh before shaking his head. "No, you just didn't lose as badly." Ed pouted at that, but was shaken from his sullen thoughts when a loud alarm sounded. "Hey!" cried out the voices of Alphonse and Nina, who came rushing out of the house. "Time's up." Naruto chuckled before collecting his coat and beginning his climb down. Ed sighed, joining Naruto. Soon they were all regrouped in front of Tucker's house, with Nina riding on top of Alexander and Ed leaning up against Alphonse, who was currently fiddling with the feather on his headpiece. Naruto looked up into the orange sky before shaking his head. "I think we should head in, Nina. Ed, Alphonse, and I are going to have to leave soon, they still need to collect their things." Nina nodded in acceptance before yawning and leaning forward onto Alexander. Naruto looked at the Elric brothers. Naruto then waved his hand in front of Alexander's face to get the great dog's attention. The dog sniffed Naruto's hand before licking it and looking up at him, almost as if looking for instruction. Naruto did not say anything, instead heading towards the front door of Tucker's house, Alexander obediently following. Naruto reached the front door and was about to open it when the door opened by itself to reveal Tucker on the other side. "Oh!" exclaimed Tucker, surprised to see the group he was going out to search for standing right on the other side of the door. "I was just about to come and look for you. I have finished my study for today, and since this is last day you three are going to be here, I thought I'd invite you in for some tea." Naruto smiled before looking back at Ed, who was also smiling at the thoughtful gesture. "Sure," replied Naruto, causing Tucker to smile, "we'd love some tea." "Oh lovely," replied Tucker. He then held open the door for everyone and led them to his living room, much like how they had met at the beginning of the week. They even sat in the same seats, with Ed, Al, and Naruto on one side and Tucker on the other. After Tucker brought them their tea, they all sat in relative silence, unable to bring up a topic. The only sound was an occasional laugh from Nina as she played with Alexander on the floor. "Mr. Tucker," began Al, getting the aforementioned person's attention. "Yes, Al? If I may ask, why did your wife leave you and Nina?" Mr. Tucker didn't respond immediately, instead choosing to sip on his tea. "Well, Al, there is something you must understand," began Tucker, breaking the sentence with another sip of tea. "Before I acquired my state alchemist certification, our lives were terrible. We were so poor then, and I guess my wife just couldn't live like that, so she left." Mr. Tucker sighed before taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked up again after a moment and replaced his glasses before continuing, "I can't afford to fail tomorrow's assessment. I don't think I could bear living like that again, and I don't want that life for Nina." Nina then turned and faced her father. "Don't worry, Daddy," she cried out, climbing on top of Alexander. "If those people do tell you no, then me and Alexander are gonna growl at them until they say yes." She emphasized the last bit of her sentence by doing her best imitation of growling, Alexander joining in with her. "That'll do it, Nina," encouraged Alphonse, laughing with everyone else at the girl's childishly naive, but nevertheless, adorable statement. Tucker smiled sadly, looking down into his tea before seemingly getting an epiphany. He looked over at Nina for a moment before smiling. "Nina," began Tucker. "Yes? How would you like to play with Daddy tomorrow?" Nina looked at her father before smiling very widely, ecstatic that she would get to help her dad. "Really?" exclaimed Nina. Tucker smiled, nodding. Nina leapt off of Alexander's back and engulfed Tucker in a hug, crying woohoo. As she did so, the group smiled as they watched a heartfelt scene when a ring was heard throughout the house, heralding the end of the Elric stay at Tucker's home. Ed, Al, and Naruto got up and bowed to Tucker, who smiled in return. Ed reached across the table and shook Tucker's hand, smiling as Nina reached out and touched their hands too. "Thank you very much for letting us review your research, Mr. Tucker," said Ed. "You are a very talented alchemist, and I am glad to have met you. Good luck on the exam tomorrow. I am sure you'll do fine." Tucker nodded, turning to Al and Naruto and extending a hand to them. Al grasped his hand and thanked him, much like his brother. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Tucker. I wish you luck on your exam. Naruto broke his handshake with Mr. Tucker before looking at Nina, who seemed slightly sad. Nina, remember what I said? Asked Naruto. Nina nodded her head before reciting, be aware of your surroundings for you never know when it might save your life. Naruto nodded before pulling out a small red ribbon. I got this for you, Nina, I hope you like it. He then walked around the table, bent down a little, and wrapped the ribbon around Nina's forehead. It's a good luck charm. Nina looked up at Naruto, speechless, before jumping out of her father's arms and wrapping her own around Naruto's neck, giving him the strongest hug she could. Naruto wrapped his arms around her as well and hugged her tight. Make sure you guys visit soon, spoke out Nina before letting go of Naruto's neck. We will, replied Naruto, right guys? Called out Naruto, addressing the brothers. Yes. They replied in unison. The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied by a knock. Honey, spoke out Tucker, it looks as if they need to get going, so finish saying your goodbyes. Nina nodded sadly before walking over to Alphonse and Ed and hugging them both. After she finished, Ed kneeled down and grasped Nina by the shoulders and looking her in the eyes. Nina, if you ever find yourself in trouble and you don't know where to go to the big building in the center of the city and ask for Roy Mustang. If they won't let you see him, then tell them your big brother, Edward Elric, told you to go to him. You got that? Nina looked at Ed for a moment before hesitantly nodding her head. Ed then stood up, ruffling her hair one last time before turning and joining Al and Naruto, who had just started on their way towards the front door of the house. The bell rang a third time, causing the trio to rush to the entrance before the caller broke down the door. They opened the door to reveal the same blonde man that had picked them up on their first day, only this time, he was smoking a cigarette. About time, I was just about to break down the door, spoke out the blonde man, smiling when he saw the exasperated faces of the Elric brothers. Oh, and when were you gonna do that, Havoc? Inquired Naruto, smirking at the man's attitude. Havoc, instead of responding, took a long deep drag of his cigarette before throwing it on the ground and putting it out with his foot. Right when I had finished my cigarette, said Havoc. Naruto laughed before turning around and closing the front door behind him. Anyway, Ed, the colonel says he needs a written report on everything that you covered while researching, as well as any theories you may have come up with. Ed groaned before nodding and asking, anything else? Havoc put his hand up to his chin in a thinking position before shaking his head. Nope, now come on you three, I have a date with Geraldine that I am not going to miss. With that said, Havoc ushered them into his car and started driving them to their lodgings. Not another one, Havoc, whined out Ed, just face it, you're bound for a single life. I resent that, Ed, cried out Havoc, she's the one. I can feel it. Ed just shook his head, muttering about how this Geraldine is the fifth one, not the one. Anyway, aside from Havoc's failing love life, what's up next? Asked Naruto. Ed looked at Naruto for a moment before shrugging. I don't know, Central I guess, Al and I haven't been to the Central Library section on bioalchemy and they sure have a lot larger collection. Naruto thought for a moment before nodding in agreement. When do you want to leave? Tomorrow I guess, after I turn in my report to Mustang, I really don't need to anything else here, said Ed. Alright, then let's make sure to pop by Tucker's on our way out, we don't want to leave without first saying goodbye to Nina. Ed and Alphonse nodded in agreement. Naruto then leaned his head back against a headrest before closing his eyes, dozing off a little as the brothers next to him began a long-winded conversation about the physical makeup of newts. What a dismal day to be leaving, stated Naruto as he walked up to the door of Tucker's house. He looked up into the dark sky, feeling the first drops of water on his face as he knocked on the door. The week had been, for the most part, sunny, so the rain clouds overhead were quite an unexpected change in atmosphere. Hey, at least it's only like this today, instead of the entire week, replied Al, always looking on the bright side of things. True, although I hope Nina isn't too sad that she won't be able to play with her dad outside, commented Ed. Both Naruto and Al nodded when Naruto knocked a second time. They waited a few minutes before knocking a third time. Perhaps they went out, suggested Al. No, not on a day as important as this, when Mustang could be coming around at any moment, stated Ed, backing up a little bit and seeing if any of the upstairs lights were on. Their car is also still here, remarked Naruto, frowning. Naruto reached forward and tried the door handle and was surprised when he found the front door unlocked. The trio walked in and took off their raincoats, placing them on the coat rack next to the door. Mr. Tucker. We're here to say goodbye to Nina since we're leaving today, called out Ed. When no response came, they started walking slowly into house. Mr. Tucker. He called, but once again there was no response. They walked further down the hallway and passed by Tucker's Chimera storage room when they heard speaking coming from inside it. Naruto looked at the door, realizing that the chains that had been binding the door before were unlocked and were nowhere to be seen. Ed grabbed the door handle to the Chimera storage room and opened. The group braced themselves for the hellishly loud cacophony of noise that had assaulted them before, but were instead met with near silence. As Ed opened the door further, light spilled into the room, revealing Tucker kneeled down next to a chimera, whispering something in its ear. "Ah, Mr. Tucker, you're home," spoke out Alphonse, happy that something hadn't befallen Tucker. Tucker turned towards them, surprised, before smiling and saying, "I did it. I finally did it." Ed's and Naruto's eyes widened at what Tucker was saying. "So, you managed to create a..." "Yes, a chimera that can understand human speech and can talk just as we do." As he said that, Tucker stood up to reveal what looked to be a demented dog with very long brown hair. "Amazing!" exclaimed Ed and Al. Tucker nodded in agreement before getting an idea. "Here, why don't I show you?" Tucker then kneeled down and looked at the chimera in its eyes. "See those people over there?" inquired Tucker, pointing to the group. The chimera nodded, garnering gasps of surprise from the two brothers. "Well, the tall one, that is Alphonse," said Tucker. The chimera looked at Al before nodding and opening its mouth. "Tall one Alphonse," spoke the chimera haltingly. Its voice, although understandable, was quite distorted and sounded like the combination of a human's voice and a dog's growl. "Very good, and see the one in the black coat, that is Naruto, Naruto." The chimera looked over at Naruto, who was frowning. "Black coat, Naruto," the dog apparently had a difficult time speaking tease. "Very good," encouraged Tucker, he then pointed towards Ed, "That person there is Edward." The chimera looked up at Ed before saying, "That person there Edward." Tucker then patted the chimera on the head before standing up and laughing with relief. "Now I don't have to worry about losing my certification." Tucker then walked to wall of the room, which was devoid of cages, and leaned up against it. Ed, on the other hand, was kneeling down so that he could see the chimera eye to eye. The chimera walked up to Ed before nudging his hand. "That person Edward," spoke the chimera again, looking Ed in the eyes, "that person Edward, Edward Ward 1 you play ninja with us, big brother." At that moment, the room became absolutely still as Ed, Al and Naruto all simultaneously came to the same conclusion. Ed looked down at the chimera before seeing in its deep blue eyes the same innocence that was in the eyes of another resident of this house. "Mr. Tucker," rang out Ed's voice, deathly hollow, "when was it that your wife left you?" Tucker placed his hand on his chin, looking as if he were trying to recall something. "Oh, I'd say about 3 years ago," replied Tucker, a small smile on his lips. "And when would you say you got your state alchemist certification?" The smile then left Tucker's lips as he placed his hand into his jacket pocket. "Also about 3 years ago," said Tucker. Suddenly a snapping noise could be heard as Ed was squeezing his automail hand so tight that the metal was bending. "I just have one more question to ask then, if you don't mind," asked Ed. "Sure, go ahead." Ed suddenly looked up from the ground to reveal tear-stained eyes as he looked at Tucker with utmost hatred. "Where are Alexander and Nina?" Suddenly, Tucker's face grew angered. Freaking brat figuring it out so quickly," spoke Tucker to himself more than to Ed, although that response was more than enough. Ed launched himself at Tucker but was stopped mid-leap by Naruto grabbing his waist. "You sick bastard. You transmuted your wife the last time you did it and now you were going to do it again. It's easier to create a chimera that can speak when one of components already knows English." Ed tried to get at Tucker but was still suspended by Naruto. "Let go of me you bastoomph." Ed was unable to continue speaking when Naruto suddenly squeezed Ed's stomach, forcing all of the air out of his chest. Naruto then dropped Ed, who started hacking and coughing from the ordeal. "What have I always said?" came out Naruto's voice, although it was barely a whisper. "What does that have to do at all with the situation?" rasped out Ed, still wheezing from having all the air forcefully expelled from his lungs. "Be aware of your surroundings," whispered out Naruto once more. "Your little sister still considers that thing to be her father," enlightened Naruto. "If she sees you hurting Tucker, you'll be indirectly hurting her as well." Ed looked up at Naruto and was thinking about lashing out at Tucker again when his eyes connected with Naruto's. Naruto's eyes were deep pits of rage, so overwhelming that even Ed's rage seemed to quell under the ocean that was Naruto's. When Naruto was sure Ed was not going to physically abuse Tucker, he put him down and instead fixed his gaze on Tucker. Naruto then released such an oppressive aura that everyone in the room stood still, eyes transfixed on him. "Tucker, there is a place in hell that is set aside for those who commit the most despicable of acts, a place below the seventh ring, where everlasting torment can't even begin to comprehend it. When I am through with you, you'll wish you were there. And when I have you begging on what is left of your hands and knees for death's sweet release, I will not give it to you. I will make you suffer for as long as humanly possible and then try to make you suffer longer." When Naruto finished, Tucker's knees buckled and he fell onto the floor in a fetal position, releasing his bodily fluids as he did so. Tucker then started muttering to himself about how at least gets to keep his state certification and pulling out his watch, holding his watch protectively as if it were his lifeline to reality. Ed looked at Tucker in rage before walking up to him and kicking the watch out of his hand. "Like hell," whispered out Ed, "like hell you're going to remain an alchemist after this." Ed then left the room, unable to bear being in the presence of Tucker and the transformed Nina. Tucker started crawling toward the watch, desperately saying that he needed the watch to remain a state alchemist. When Tucker was about to reach his watch however, a knife flew from Naruto's hands, impaling the watch and causing multiple parts to fly in all directions. Tucker then started whimpering before crying as he curled up in an unresponsive ball. Al, who had been watching silently, then picked up Chimera Nina and brought her into the hall, where she then walked up to Edward, who was sitting with his face in his hands and started nudging him. "Edward Ard, can we play ninja now?" Ed looked at Nina before ruffling the Chimera's hair, just like he had done with Nina the day before. "I'm sorry Nina," replied Ed, disregarding the inquiry, "I'm sorry we can't change you back, I'm sorry." Ed then started to cry into his hands once more. Nina just nudged Ed's hand some more. "Ed, can we play? Can we Ed?" Ed then looked up at the transformed Nina again, realizing that she would be like this for the rest of her unnatural life. It soon became too much for him, and before he knew what he was doing, he let out a loud, horrible pain-filled scream that echoed throughout the house. At that moment, thunder sounded, and first moments of torrential downpour began. Ed, Naruto, and Al were sitting on the front step of Tucker's home. None of them were talking, instead just embracing the cold rain that was falling as they thought of the atrocities that someone could commit. "If there was ever a case of the devil's work in this world," rang out the voice of Riza as both she and Mustang exited Tucker's house, "then this would be it." Mustang stopped beside the trio, standing next to Ed, before looking up into the sky. "The devil," replied Mustang introspectively, "the state alchemist must be willing to act, able to take another's life when ordered to and without question. In many ways, Mr. Tucker's actions and our own may not be that far apart when it comes to interfering with others' lives." Mustang then pulled out his own alchemist's watch, looking down at it and opening it. "We choose our own path, knowing full well what we are doing, and that's the way it is, right Fullmetal?" Roy Mustang looked down at Ed, who was still unresponsive, before snapping his watch close and slipping it into his jacket. "You will more than likely come across cases like this again in the future," said Mustang, as he began walking towards the door leaving the estate. "You may even have to get your own hands dirty in the process. If you are going to shut down like this every time, then you don't belong in the military." "We may be called the dogs of the military," replied Ed, looking up at the retreating back of Mustang. "We may even be cursed as devils." This caused Mustang to stop and turn, listening to what Ed had to say, "But Al and we are still going to get our bodies back." Ed then looked up into the sky, letting the rain wash away his tears. "I know the truth, Mustang. I know we are not devils. I know we are not gods. But damn it, we couldn't even save one little innocent girl. We are human, damn it." Ed then stood up before crying out, "We're only human." Releasing all the pain and resentment he felt in that one scream that was slowly eating up the rain. Tucker was sitting in his office with the Chimera Nina sitting across from him. He sighed before looking out into the rainy night sky. It hadn't stopped raining since Ed left and it didn't look like it would let up soon. Tucker then turned back to the Chimera who had been Nina before patting his knee, urging her to come forward. "Why doesn't anyone understand Daddy, Nina?" inquired Tucker as Nina padded over to him, eventually resting her head on his knee. "I only did what was best for our family." Tucker petted the top of Nina's head before a sound alerted them both to a third presence in the room. Tucker looked at the door to see a tall man standing there, although he was cloaked in shadow. "Who is there?" "You're not with military," said Tucker. The man then walked into the light to reveal brown skin, white hair, and dark sunglasses. He wore a yellow, high-collared jacket with a white undershirt. The undershirt was stained with flecks of blood. His pants were a solid black, blending in with his black military combat boots. The most striking feature about this man however was a great white X-shaped scar going across his nose and face. The scar contrasted heavily with the man's otherwise brown skin. "You're Shu Tucker, the sewing life alchemist, correct?" inquired the man. Tucker started to become frightened when he saw the blood on the man's shirt and quickly got up out of his chair and backed up to the wall of his office. "Who are you? How did you get in?" "There are military police outside," cried out Tucker, becoming more frightened as the man slowly walked forward. The scarred man took his right hand out of his pocket and stopped when he was within arm's reach of Tucker. "Those foolish alchemists," began the man, "who stray from the path of God and his divine creations, shall be punished." At that last statement, the man reached forward and grabbed Tucker's forehead. Not a moment later, blue alchemical light flared from the scarred man's hand and engulfed Tucker's body for a split second. Blood exploded from Tucker's body as every single cell inside him simultaneously burst. The scarred man then looked toward the chimera, which had walked up to Tucker's corpse and was nudging his hand, attempting to elicit a response from the dead man. The scarred man kneeled down, placing a hand on Nina's back in consolation. "You poor creature, once you've been turned this way, there is never a way of separating you back into your component parts." The scarred man then stood up before walking in front of the chimera and looking it in the eyes. "At least," the man placed his hand on Nina's head, "your passing will be in peace." For those who remember. Ed, Al, and Naruto were walking down the hallway towards Roy Mustang's office in Eastern Command. An air of gloom was around them. The events of the previous day were still heavy on their consciousness and they were going to Roy to see what would happen to Nina and Tucker. The trio came up to Mustang's door and Ed was about to knock when the door opened to reveal Riza. Riza stopped and looked at the group, surprised, before straightening up and resuming her stoic demeanor. "You guys are up early. What's the matter?" inquired Riza, turning around and locking Mustang's office door. "We need to know," began Ed, solemnly, "what is going to happen to Tucker and Nina. They're not going to ship her off to some lab, are they?" Riza looked as though she were surprised before her eyes became sad and she sighed. Mr. Tucker was going to be stripped of his rank and stand trial for what he did to Nina, but she paused for a moment, "They've both been murdered." Al and Ed gasped. Ed's face became a picture of horror as he learned that the little girl he couldn't save from a life as a chimera now had no life at all. Naruto, who had kept his head tilted down, not wanting to talk to anybody, was now looking fiercely at Riza. "Who killed them?" inquired Naruto, his voice holding an extreme undertone of anger. Riza shook her head, pushing her way through the trio as she did and making her way down the hall. "We don't know who killed them," replied Riza, slinging her blue military coat on over her shoulder. "I was just heading over to the scene now." "I shall accompany you," stated Naruto. Riza stopped and looked at Naruto. "Sir, I don't," and she stopped when she felt an oppressive aura emanating from Naruto, crushing her will to resist. "Do not test me on this subject, I will accompany you." The aura then dispersed until only a small vibe of anger could be felt from Naruto. Riza stood still for a moment before turning stiffly and resuming her walk down the hallway. "We're coming to," came out Al's voice, although it sounded slightly frightened. "No," replied both Naruto and Riza. "Why not?" inquired Ed, angrily. Naruto stopped before turning around and leveling a hard gaze at Ed. "Ed," began Naruto, "there are some things that you don't need to see. Things that you will wish you had never seen and will haunt you for the rest of your life. Trust me, you don't want to see this." Ed looked as if he were about to retort, but instead, he turned away and fell to his knees, tears coming down his face. Al knelt down next to his brother, putting his hand on Ed's back and rubbing, comforting his brother. Naruto looked at the two for a moment, then turned and followed Riza, who was already at the stairwell going down to main floor. He caught up to her as she was leaving Eastern Command. They continued to walk in relative silence all the way to Riza's car. It took Riza only a few seconds to get her car running and another few to get it onto the main road, heading towards the wealthy section, East City's residential district. "That was a good thing you did," stated Riza, breaking the silence that had been between them since Naruto's outburst at Ed. Naruto shrugged. "I am sure you would have done the same," replied Naruto, turning and looking out at the dark rainy streets of East City. Riza didn't reply, instead focusing on the road. After a while, the silence between the two went from being strained to comfortable as they both realized that the other preferred silence. Naruto was standing near the doorway to Tucker's attic where Tucker and Nina were supposedly killed. Apparently, he and Riza were the last ones to get to the scene as the group already there were well into discussing the killer. "He's is always one step ahead of us," said one of the men around the two corpses, frustrated. This man was about an inch under Naruto, although he was kneeling at the moment. He had brown hair and eyes, which were covered by a pair of small rectangular glasses that gave him a look of intelligence. "We must find him quickly," replied another man, this one standing behind the first. The man who replied was by far the most noticeable of all the people in the room. He stood at a freakishly tall 7.5 feet. He was also exceedingly muscular, having the build of only the most elite of bodybuilders. His head was bald, except for a small blonde hair that stuck out in front, which curled on his forehead. "But the way things are going, we'll have a lot more dead bodies before this is over." "It sounds as though you were expecting this," stated a third man. The third man was none other than Roy Mustang himself. The kneeling man nodded before standing up and heading towards the doorway, the tall, muscular man following behind him. "We Billy." It was at this moment that the trio of men actually noticed Naruto and Riza's presence in the room, having been engrossed in the conversation at hand. "Sir," began the one with glasses, "I do not believe you have permission to be on these premises, I must ask you to "Don't worry, Colonel," interjected Riza, "he's with me." The man looked over at Riza for a moment, then went back to examining Naruto. After a moment, he simply shrugged. Mustang coughed, gaining the man's attention. "We were saying," stated Mustang. "Well, we believe that the murder is by a serial killer known as Scar," stated the man. Naruto and Riza followed the trio of men out of the room, leaving the forensics team in the attic to do their job. "Scar?" inquired Roy, confused by the name. "We don't have an actual name yet and we have only been able to identify him as a man with tan skin and a large cross-shaped scar across his face." "Why is he the main suspect?" inquired Naruto, stopping the three men in front of him. The man with the spectacles turned to Roy, who nodded before turning to Naruto. "Scar has been responsible for the confirmed murders of over 6 state alchemists and the suspected murder of an additional 3, said the man with the spectacles. "Has he only been targeting state alchemists?" inquired Naruto, an urgency entering his voice. "So far," replied the man. Naruto's eyes widened and before anyone knew what was happening, Naruto dashed down the stairs and out of the house, moving at inhuman speed. Mustang, Riza, and the two men were gawking at the speed at which Naruto exited, not believing that a human could move so fast. The man with the spectacles was the first to break out of the stupor that Naruto's speed had left them in. "What just happened?" inquired the bespectacled man. "It seems that man had realized something," replied Riza. "What did he realize?" inquired the tall muscled man. "We were talking about Scar," stated the bespectacled man, then about his targets. "Which are state alch," continued Riza, although she was cut off by Roy. "Ed?" exclaimed Roy, rushing down the stairs as fast as he could, the tall man, Riza, and the bespectacled man following close behind. 10 minutes earlier. Ed and Al were sitting on top of one of Eastern Command's numerous office buildings. The buildings, although not actually part of the Eastern Command's main building, usually held the majority of East City's military statistics workforce. The brothers were sitting on this particular building because it had a radio tower on it, which had a concrete base that was much more comfortable to sit on than the roof. Ed was leaning against his brother, looking up at the rainy skies, not caring if any drops fell on him, since he was already thoroughly soaked. "Hey Al," said Ed, leaning off his brother and swinging his legs down so that he was sitting normally. "Yes brother," replied Al. "I've been thinking about this for a long time." Ed started to swing his legs, his automail one making a clanking sound every time it hit the concrete. "What is it brother?" inquired Al, turning to look down at his brother. "We've placed all of our faith and trust in alchemy, but really, what is it?" stated Ed, depressed. "We've been taught that alchemy is the science of understanding the flow of matter and its laws. The process of comprehension, deconstruction, and reconstruction. And the world flows too, as it must also follow laws. Everything, no matter what, always circulates. Even death is just a part of the circle. I thought I understood that, I truly did, but I didn't. Mom proves that." Ed then chuckled morbidly, and now here we are, once again, trying to figure out how to do the impossible. Ed sighed, before looking up once again at the rain. "I'm such a hopeless idiot, all this time, all this effort, all this research and I haven't grown up one bit. I thought that, perhaps, this rain could wash away some of the gloom that is following us, but every drop that hits me just makes me even more depressed." Al turned away from Ed, before mimicking his brother and looking up at the sky, the rain making metallic pings as it hit his armor. "I don't even get that much," replied Al. "Without a body, I don't even get to feel the rain hit my face." Al then looked down at his brother. "That is something I miss. All the time I want to get my body back brother. I want it so badly it hurts." "You, boy," rang out a deep voice across the roof, "you're the Fullmetal Alchemist, Edward Elric, correct?" Ed looked up numbly to see a dark-skinned man in a yellow high-collared jacket with a scar crisscrossing his face. Ed didn't quite react when he saw the man reach his hand back and flex it, instead just watching as the man serenely launched his hand forward, intent on grabbing Ed's head. Ed was shaken from his unresponsive state when his brother grasped his collar and yanked him to the side. A moment later, the scarred man's hand grasped the metal girder that had been directly behind Ed's head. Blue light erupted from the scarred man's hand and the metal girder started warping and twisting before blowing apart in a shower of metallic shrapnel. Ed and Al leapt back from the shower of metal, Ed pressing his hands together and placing them on the roof, raising a column of stone around the man and the exploding shrapnel. "What the hell was that about?" inquired Ed, breathing in deeply as the adrenaline started to kick in. Neither Ed nor Al had time to hear a response as the column of stone exploded outwards, revealing the scarred man holding his arm out as though he had just pressed it against a stone. The man brought his arm down before walking towards the brothers, kicking debris out of his way as he went. Ed didn't waste a second, turning and heading for the ladder that went down to street below. "Come on Al, let's go," yelled Ed, grasping the metal ladder and sliding his way down. The scarred man walked to the edge of the roof and looked down at the rapidly descending brothers. He placed his right hand on the metal of the ladder. Blue light erupted from the point of contact and raced down the ladder until it reached the place the Elrics, where the ladder then proceeded to explode outwards and launch the two brothers into the street below. Fortunately, the brothers were only about 12 feet off the ground and, with Ed having a superhuman arm and leg and Al being completely made of metal, there were no debilitating injuries. The two brothers then looked back up at the scarred man, only to gasp out in horror when they saw him slam his hand down on the office building. The entire office building was then engulfed in the crackling blue light of the scarred man's alchemy. The building started to shake and, not a moment later, the bottom floors of the building gave out, causing it to tilt forward and start crumbling down. The roof, however, stayed intact and the scarred man was clinging onto it and riding out the crumbling building. Right as the roof was about to impact the ground, the man jumped off of it, landing in the street roughly 10 feet from the brothers. The brothers then turned and sprinted as hard as they could, away from the scarred man who was quick in pursuit. "What the hell is this guy's problem?" cried out Ed, slamming his hands together and quickly stopping to touch the ground. A wall of stone rose up, but Ed didn't wait around, instead resuming his sprint. A moment later, an explosion could be heard and the brothers looked back to see the wall in pieces and the scarred man quickly catching up to them. "What have I done to get this guy to want to kill me?" cried out Ed in fear and frustration. "Well, you haven't exactly been avoiding making enemies, brother," replied Al, who was a little ahead of Ed. Ed frowned in response as both he and Al turned down a small alley that they both knew led to the main road. Before they could make it out however, blue light raced ahead of them and collapsed part of the building on the side of the alley, which blocked their escape. Ed and Al stopped, lest they be crushed by the falling rubble. They turned around and looked at the scarred man, who was standing at the entrance to the alley. "Why are you after us?" cried out Ed, looking frightened. "As long as there are creators like you in this world, there must also be destroyers like me," said the scarred man. Ed placed his hands together before grabbing a metal pipe sticking out of a piece of rubble with his right hand. "Then it looks like we'll have to fight," replied Ed, blue light erupting from his hand as he transmuted the pipe into a long machete-type knife. He and Al then got up and simultaneously rushed the scarred man. "You've got spirit, kid," replied the scarred man, smiling, but the scarred man that twisted until his body was sideways, avoiding the two brothers' attacks almost effortlessly. "You're too slow." The scarred man then grasped Al's armor, right where his kidneys would have been. Blue light engulfed Al's suit and a moment later, over half of it exploded into small metallic bits, much like the metal girder of the radio tower. Scar's eyes widened in surprise, however, when he saw the lack of body inside of the armor. "Empty," stated the scarred man. "You bastard," cried out Ed, charging the scarred man and thrusting his knife at the man's face. The scarred man moved his head to the left, grasping Ed's right arm with his hand. "You're still too slow," he said as blue light engulfed Ed's arm. But instead of exploding, it simply made a metallic ding as Scar's alchemy rebounded. Scar looked genuinely surprised before slamming Ed's arm with his left hand, knocking the knife out of it. Ed lashed out with one of his legs, but he was thrust back by the scarred man before his foot could connect. The scarred launched his foot forward, knocking Ed back into the street. Ed grunted in frustration as he rolled back and stood up, taking off his red coat. The scarred man's eyes narrowed in comprehension. "So, you possess an auto-mail arm. That explains why my attack did not do as much damage as I expected." He then watched as Ed tossed his jacket to the side and pressed his hands together. Ed placed his left hand over the back of his right one, and blue light engulfed his auto-mail hand as he transmuted the metal backhand into a long blade. "Brother," cried out Al, as he pulled himself forward with his one arm, pieces falling off of him as he went. "Don't fight, run." Ed looked at his brother before shaking his head. "You idiot," replied Ed, "I'm not just gonna leave you behind." "So," stated the scarred man, gaining the brother's attention, "you place your hands together and make an alchemic ring, using your body as the circle, then you perform transmutation. Now I see." He then dodged to the side as Ed thrust his bladed hand at his face. The scarred man grabbed Ed's arm with his left hand. The scarred man then locked Ed's legs in his own before pressing his right hand up to Ed's auto-mail shoulder. "I must begin by destroying this infernal right arm of yours, brother," cried out Al as he furiously tried to move to help his brother. But, due to his state of disrepair, he was helpless. "Now, Edward Elric, you will not be able to use your heretical alchemy," stated the scarred man, slowly walking towards Ed. Ed gasped in fear before scrambling backwards and, without his arm to balance him, falling on his face. Ed then turned and faced up towards the scarred man. The man stopped above Ed. "I will give you a moment to pray to gods," stated the man. "Brother. Run away," cried out Al, desperation apparent in his voice. "Unfortunately," stated Ed, sitting up and looking defiantly at the scarred man, "there isn't any god I'd like to pray to." "Pity," stated the scarred man, leaning down. "Am I the only one you're after today?" inquired Ed, or are you also going to kill my brother too? The scarred man leaned back up before looking back at the desperately moving Al. He then turned back toward Ed. If your brother interferes, then I will eliminate him, replied the scarred man, however it is only you, Fullmetal Alchemist, that will be receiving divine judgment today. Then promise me, demanded Ed, that after you kill me, you will not hurt my brother. The scarred man nodded. I swear, I will keep that promise. Scar then leaned down and reached his right hand back. No brother, don't do this. Run away. Cried out Al, however Ed didn't respond, instead closing his eyes and waiting. Scar then launched his hand forward, blue light already engulfing it in preparation for Ed's head. Brother no. Cried out Al, and then blue light blinded both Al and Ed. Ed felt something warm drip onto his face. He opened his eyes and looked up, only to see a black cloak above him and the stump of what used to be an arm in front of his face. You know Ed, came out a voice that both Ed and Al recognized, although it was breathing very haggardly, you still need to get better at hiding. Mr. Naruto. Yelled out Al's voice, elation apparent. Naruto didn't reply, instead launching his foot forward and kicking the scarred man back into the wall of the alley. Naruto then stood up from his crouched position and walked forward before grabbing Ed. Sorry, mumbled out Naruto, his muscles flexing as he threw Ed into the alley, right by Al. Naruto took a deep inhale, attempting to regain some of his lost breath. After a moment, he felt the warm liquid of his blood rolling down his side, so grabbed a clasp that held his coat up and tore it off, his cloak falling to his feet. Naruto looked down at the stump of his left shoulder before facing the scarred man. Now I am sure I know who you are, but just for formality's sake, Naruto moved into a combative stance, I assume you are the one they call Scar. That is correct, replied Scar, setting his foot back, preparing to move. Who are you? Naruto chuckled morbidly before rushing forward at nearly inhuman speed, raising his right hand to strike Scar. Scar dodged to the left, just barely avoiding Naruto's fist, which cratered into the wall of the alley. Scar then attempted to grab Naruto's arm, but was unable to do so, as Naruto's pulled his hand out of the wall of the alley and spun, kicking Scar in the side and launching him into the other wall of the alley. As the Scar's head impacted into the wall, it whipped forward, throwing the man's tinted glasses onto the ground in front of him. You know that chimera you killed? That was a little girl, stated Naruto, turning towards the scarred man. Scar hacked up a large globule of blood as he pushed himself out of the crater in the alley wall. Scar fell into his knees, grabbing his side as he did. That thing was an abomination unto God, stated Scar, looking up at Naruto with his uncovered eyes, whatever it was before doesn't matter. What it became was a perverted distortion of the one true God's creation. Naruto was stopped in place, surprised by Scar's eyes. Instead of a normal color, such as the common greens or browns found in Amistris, Scar's eyes were red. Naruto laughed morbidly, hacking up a small bit of blood. Of course you would be after state alchemists, Naruto wiped the blood dribbling down his chin, his eyes hardening as his body flexed to move. Ishvalan. Scar leapt to the side, barely avoiding Naruto's leg as it impacted into the wall of the alley. Scar stumbled out of the alley, falling forward, inadvertently avoiding a kick from Naruto. Scar spun around, aiming to knock one of Naruto's legs out from under him. Naruto instead lifted his leg and stomped down on Scar's leg. A distinctive snap could be heard as the bone in Scar's leg broke. Scar grunted out in pain as he twisted out from under Naruto's foot, pulling himself forward and hopping up, limping away from Naruto, who started to sway dangerously. It seems Ishvalan that your alchemy reached part of my lung, stated Naruto, coughing up a large amount of blood and falling down onto his knee. He looked up at Scar, who was grasping his leg in pain. Unfortunately I will be unable to continue our fight, Naruto coughed up another globule of blood before tilting his head down and smiling slightly, perfect timing. Scar looked at Naruto warily before slowly approaching his unmoving form. Scar stopped in front of Naruto, looking down at him. Wordlessly, Scar reached forward with his right hand and was about to grasp Naruto's head when a click made him leap back. A moment later, 3 gunshots rang throughout the street, holes appearing right where Scar had been standing a moment prior. Scar landed on his broken leg, causing him to collapse onto the ground and let out a grunt of pain. Scar looked down the street before snarling in controlled frustration. On one end of the street was Mustang and Rizza, along with the muscled man and the bespectacled man. The gun that had just gone off was in Rizza's hand and she was looking down at sights with expert focus. On the other was a rapidly growing blockade of military soldiers. That is enough. Called out Mustang, gaining Scar's attention, you will not be killing anyone else today, Scar. We are taking you into custody where you will answer for the murders of at least 10 state alchemists and over 30 Amestrian soldiers and personnel. Scar stood up, looking back and forth between Mustang and the rapidly increasing wall of soldiers. He turned toward Mustang. Alchemists alter things from their natural form, perverting them into something else, something grotesque. They profane God, the true creator of all things, Scar declared. Scar then raised his right arm, revealing it to all who could see, as an agent of God, I must hand down his judgment upon those who would corrupt his creations. Blue light engulfed Scar's hand as he slammed it down onto the cobblestone of the street. Crackling blue light covered the street, and almost immediately after the street collapsed into the sewers below. What the hell? Rang out Mustang's voice, as dust engulfed the area, obscuring everyone's view. When the dust had settled, the majority of the street had fallen into the sewers, leaving a gaping hole, and Scar was nowhere to be seen. The bastard got into the sewers, stated the bespectacled man from before, staring into the hole. Roy growled in frustration. Everyone, called out Roy, start setting up blockades at all known exits from the sewers, we cannot let Scar escape. Roy then sighed, before remembering the whole reason he was here. Fullmetal, called out Roy, not being able to see the young alchemist anywhere. Here, called out Ed from his place in the alley. Mustang walked around the large hole that Scar had made in the street until he was directly opposite the Elric brothers. After seeing their state of being, Mustang was quick to react. Major Armstrong, called out Mustang. The tall man from the Tucker residence popped up from among the rubble, having already begun to move some of the larger pieces of stone. Yes, replied the now-named Armstrong. Let the Elrics out onto the main road so that they can receive treatment. Foe. No. Called out Ed, gaining the two older men's attention. First find Naruto, he is gravely wounded. Armstrong looked at Ed, confused, before looking back towards Mustang for enlightenment. Naruto was the man who was with us in Tucker's house, informed Roy, scanning the rubble for Naruto, or if not Naruto, then at least his corpse. The soldiers that had barricaded the end of the street started filtering down into the rubble, searching for civilians or injured personnel. Hey, I got someone over here. Called out one of the soldiers. Mustang rushed over to the soldier, preparing himself. What he saw, however, was not what he had been expecting. Instead of a man writhing in the agony of a lost limb, Mustang found Naruto calmly instructing the soldier in the rudimentary procedure of first aid. Naruto seemed to sense Mustang and looked up when Mustang came within viewing distance. Oh, hello Mr. Mustang. Naruto coughed up another large amount of blood before looking up at Mustang. You took your sweet time getting here. Mustang frowned before finally noticing Naruto's arm. True, but I am also not the one missing an arm here, now am I, replied Mustang, climbing down the rim of the hole and walking over to Naruto. Naruto looked up at Mustang before looking down at his own missing left arm. Yeah, I guess that is true, Naruto sighed before leaning back against a piece of rubble he had sat by. So, I guess you spoke with her? Inquired Naruto, turning his head toward Mustang. Mustang nodded, placing his left hand into his coat pocket. Good, then I guess I can ask you to do this with a relative ease of mind. What? Inquired Mustang. Naruto leaned forward and took a deep breath, his face starting to become visibly pale from the blood loss. Cauterize it, stated Naruto, looking up at Mustang's widening eyes. Mustang frowned, pulling his hand out his pocket and reaching into his coat. He pulled out, not a set of gloves, but a lighter. Naruto looked at the lighter inquisitively. The rain messes with my gloves, stated Roy, flipping the lighter open. He placed his thumb on the flint wheel. You sure about this? Inquired Mustang. Naruto looked up at Mustang and laughed grimly. Do you really think I would ask something like this on a whim? Inquired Naruto patronizingly, I know what is coming. Mustang nodded and sparked the lighter. The column of white flame rushed down the lighter, impacting with Naruto's left shoulder. The flesh immediately began to sizzle and blacken. The smell of burning flesh and cloth filled the air, causing the soldier that had been standing near them to back away in disgust. Naruto's body seized up, but he did not cry out or moan, instead simply staring at the broken cobble in front of him. After about 10 seconds of continuous heat, Mustang cut off the flame to reveal the burnt stump of Naruto's arm. Burned, but completely sealed. Thanks, stated Naruto, leaning back against the rubble once again and taking a deep breath, I think I should get some rest. Mustang just watched as Naruto fell into a light sleep, turning to leave only when the stretcher had come to take Naruto away. Mustang climbed out of the collapsed street and walked over to the Elric brothers, who were leaned up against one of the buildings near the end of the street, where the ground hadn't collapsed. You know that you're a really big pain in my neck, right Ed? Stated Roy, leaning up against the wall next to the elder Elric. Ed looked up at Roy before laughing hollowly. Yeah. We're gonna need to keep this pretty quiet, you realize, stated the bespectacled man, walking up to Ed, Roy and Al. Ed looked up at the newcomer before smiling slightly. Hey Mr. Hughes, I didn't know you were in East City. Yeah, my crew and I were in pursuit of Scar after he had been spotted in Central. Hughes turned toward the sewer, frowning, I guess we lost him again. No. We have him cornered, and from what I saw, Naruto broke his leg, so he can't be moving too fast. We just need to stay vigilant and keep anything from coming out of that sewer without being inspected, replied Roy. If we do that, we'll catch him, eventually. I guess, but that is a big if, replied Hughes. He placed his hand on Roy's shoulder, gripping it reassuringly. Best of luck. Hughes then looked down at the Elrics before turning and heading towards one of the two cars that brought Armstrong and him to the scene. Where are you off to? Inquired Roy, turning towards the retreating Hughes. Hughes stopped and turned around. I was on a pursuit mission, and since it is now under your jurisdiction, I have to report to Central Command and update them on the situation, replied Hughes. Don't worry, I won't mention the Elric situation to the higher-ups. Roy looked at Hughes, quite confused. Hughes was, in essence, giving Roy the go-ahead to take credit for the capture of Scar, should that ever happen. Hughes just chuckled before waving and turning, resuming his walk towards the cars. Hey, Roy turned towards Ed, who had spoken. How is Naruto? He's on his way to the hospital, replied Roy. Ed seemed to sulk at that, his head and shoulders falling forward slightly. What exactly happened, Ed? Inquired Roy, kneeling down so that he was near eye level with the two brothers. He saved my idiot brother's life, replied Al, slight anger in his voice. Roy and Ed looked over at Al, who was leaned up against the building with his metal arm and leg leaned up next to him. Ed was stopped when Al's remaining fist impacted with his brother's face. What the hell, Al? Exclaimed Ed, holding his face, which was already turning red from the impending bruise. Why didn't you run away when I told you to? Cried out Al, chips of metal falling from his body as he spoke. Are you insane? Replied Ed, he could have killed Yo. Ed was once again interrupted by his brother's fist. Damn it, Al, stop hitting me. No. I need to beat the idiot out of you. Al swung his fist, although Ed anticipated it this time and leaned backwards in order to dodge it. I'm not an idiot, Al. He could have killed you. Stated Ed, leaning forward. Yes you are. Replied Al, only an idiot makes the decision to die. How is it idiotic to sacrifice oneself for the one they love? Yelled Ed in response. Ed was then yanked forward, his brother having grabbed his shirt. You don't get it, stated Al, we need to stay alive so that we can get our bodies back and help people like Nina. We can't do that if we are dead. Al thrust his brother back onto the ground, but in doing so, caused his remaining arm to fail and separate from his body, leaving him armless and legless. MIT. Exclaimed his brother in frustration, now my arm has fallen off because my brother is a big, stupid, idiot. Ed looked up at his raging brother, utterly surprised by his uncharacteristic outburst. Ed leaned forward, feeling suddenly spent. He looked at his own scrapped arm, before looking up at his brother and smiling. We're really falling apart here, aren't we? Stated Ed, moving up to his brother and leaning against him, we look like we belong in a junk heap. We're still alive though, replied Al, looking up at the receding rain clouds. Yep, Ed held his human hand up and looked at it, we're still alive. Naruto opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the white of the hospital ceiling. After a minute or two of just staring at the ceiling, Naruto grew bored and yawned, before sitting up. You know, the medical staff flipped their shit when you didn't get an infection. Naruto looked left to see Roy, Ed, and Al sitting on the room's guest chairs, although Al was actually situated on top of a moving trolley, as he could not sit without any legs. Roy was the one who had spoken. Naruto smiled, before chuckling lightly. I have a very strong immune system, replied Naruto, rolling his head on his shoulders and cracking any kinks out of his neck. No one spoke for a while, and soon the room was filled with a slightly uncomfortable silence. So, how long have I been out? Inquired Naruto. 2 days, replied Roy. Naruto's eyes narrowed, before lying back down on his bed. Damn, thought Naruto, I was out a lot longer than usual. Naruto turned his head toward Roy. So, have you caught him yet? Mustang shook his head. Scar is still in the sewers, replied Roy, sighing, we have yet to organize a task force to go into the sewers to find him. We think he is probably unable to move very well, due to his injury. He's Ishvalan, stated Naruto, causing Mustang's eyes to widen in surprise. That is quite enlightening. Mustang stood up, before bowing slightly towards Naruto and the brothers, I must go, I wish you three well. Ed, alert me when you guys reach Central. I will have one of my men pick you up there. Until then, Mustang then left, leaving just Naruto and the Elrics. What did he mean by enlightening? Inquired Ed, leaning forward to listen. Naruto sighed, before propping himself up on his elbow and sitting completely up. Okay, began Naruto, how much do you guys know about the war? Almost nothing, replied Ed, we were pretty young when it started and we were 9 or 10 when it was concluded. The only thing that I know is that the country dumped most of its resources into the war and that we had a period of time during the end of the war where famine was so widespread that we lost nearly a third of our total population. Naruto nodded. That is a good start. I guess I won't have to explain the economic repercussions of the war. Naruto took a deep breath before beginning his explanation. The Ishvalans were a race of nomadic desert people who hailed from the region of Ishval. They worshipped a god known as Ishvala, the one true creator. That was who Scar was talking about. Exclaimed Al. That is correct, replied Naruto, taking a breath before continuing. The Ishvalans viewed alchemy as one of the most profane acts against Ishvala and prohibited its use on their land. This rule was held strong even after the annexation of Ishval. Due to their highly clashing cultures, relations between Amistris and Ishval were very strained, and any diplomatic discussions generally ended with both sides unwilling to relent to the other's demands. After about 4 years of this, tensions were high and both sides were hostile. Naruto rubbed the bridge of his nose, taking a deep breath and continuing. Hostilities were brought to a tipping point when an Amestrian soldier accidentally shot and killed an Ishvalan child. The effect was immediate and, not a day later, the first uprising occurred in the hometown of the child who was shot. From there, it just spread, uprising after uprising. A month later, nearly all of eastern Amistris had been covered in Ishvalan forces. Thus began the Ishvalan Civil War, or the Ishvalan War of Extermination. Naruto took a moment to take another breath. After nearly 7 years of continuous conflict, Amistris had finally managed to push the Ishvalan forces all the way back into their original Holy Lands, but at the cost of nearly all their resources. Unable to rout out the last of the Ishvalan military and not having the resources for an all-out siege, Fuhrer King Bradley ordered the use of state alchemists in the extermination of the Ishvalan race. Naruto looked at Ed, who was leaning forward and contemplating all that Naruto had said. Needless to say, continued Naruto, the use of state alchemists proved to be quite effective. Within days, 35 state alchemists achieved what 12,000 Amestrian soldiers never could. The complete and utter extermination of the Ishvalan people. Some would say that Scar is justified in what he is doing. No way. Cried out Ed, standing up and looking at Naruto with angered eyes. There is no justification for the killing of those who had nothing to do with the war. And do you think that all of Ishval was behind this war? Replied Naruto, stopping Ed's rant. Most of the war was fought by Ishvalan radicals, people who were already planning a rebellion and just used that child's death as a means to an end. Even so, what Scar is doing is not righting a wrong. He is just killing under the guise of a justice and calling it an act of God. Still, the fact is that he is hunting you down. Even if his reasons are unjust, his drive is very real. We cannot hesitate next time, stated Naruto, swinging his legs out of bed, and Ed. Yeah? If it ever comes to it, where Scar is in pursuit of you and I am not there, I need you and your brother to run. Ed looked as if he were going to retort, but instead hung his head down. Okay, replied Ed, although he desperately wanted to say otherwise. Good, stated Naruto, hopping off of the bed. He was about to leave the room when he noticed his medical garb. Now where is my coat? Brother packed it in his suitcase, stated Al from his place on the trolley. Naruto looked over towards Ed, who was looking a little embarrassed. I was hoping you would still accompany us. I know the best automobile mechanic in the country and, well, you know, I could probably get her to make you a new arm. Stated Ed, looking down slightly, but you don't have to if you don't want to. It hit Naruto all at once. He realized that these two boys were still just children and he had been viewing them as adults. I'll get it you. Ed was cut off by a great bellowing laugh from Naruto. I appreciate it Ed, I really do, but how did you expect to get me out of here without any of my clothes on? Were you going to drag my comatose body out and onto a train? Ed didn't respond, instead seeming to shrink in on himself before reaching under the trolley and retrieving his suitcase. He opened it and dug through his clothes before taking a flat bundle wrapped in paper. Here, stated Ed, handing the bundle over to Naruto. Thanks, replied Naruto, tearing open the paper and pulling out his black coat, red shirt and pants. Naruto walked into the washroom his room provided and changed, coming out a moment later with a hospital gown draped over his arm. We couldn't find your shoes or your hat at the street, stated Ed, still a little embarrassed by his blunder. Naruto shrugged. That's fine, they're replaceable. The only thing of import is my coat. So long as I have that, I will be fine. Ed and Al looked at Naruto strangely before ultimately chalking it up to his irregularities. So, Ed, where to next? Inquired Naruto, tying his left arm sleeve into a knot. Well, Al and I need some serious repair, stated Ed, getting a nod in agreement from Naruto. I think it is a good time to see my mechanic. Scar stumbled to a stop, leaning against the wall of the sewer. He slid down the wall until he was sitting, holding his leg in pain. He looked down at it, seeing the point where the bone in his leg had broken the skin. After trudging through the sewers for 2 days, he had no doubt in his mind that it had been infected. The area around the wound was hot with red lines radiating down from it and pus was seeping out around the bone. It smelled like spoiled meat. Scar was disturbed from his moment of rest by the sound of heavy footsteps coming from further down the tunnel, as well as several dozen rats running past him, seemingly fleeing from something. Scar turned his head to look down the tunnel, but leapt up at what he saw. Rounding the corner of the tunnel was something. The creature was humanoid, but it was definitely not human. It was short. Standing at around 5'4", it had a bald head and large nose. The thing's forearms were overly large, much larger than its biceps. Its torso was less like a human and looking more like an eggplant. This was only accentuated by the skin-tight black bodysuit the creature was wearing. Scar started to back up slowly, hoping to avoid this creature's attention for as long as possible. The moment Scar moved, the creature's head snapped toward him, showing bright red demonic-looking eyes. The creature started taking slow lumbering steps toward Scar, who had since gotten into a pseudo-combat stance. The creature suddenly started sprinting toward Scar, who was surprised by such speed, given the creature's body. Smell, the creature leapt at Scar, who sidestepped it, before stumbling back into the sewer canal, covering himself in sewage. The creature turned toward Scar suddenly and smiled horrifically. You. The creature once again leapt at Scar, this time opening its mouth, preparing to take a bite out of Scar. Scar, once again, sidestepped the creature. Scar grabbed the creature's arm as it flew past, and a split second later, the arm was no longer attached to the creature, instead falling into the sewer water below. Instead of blood falling out of the wound however, red lighting arsed across the skin, and within seconds, the arm that Scar had taken off grew back, exactly as it had been before. That hurt. Cried out the creature, its bloodlust temporarily culled by the pain. The creature turned to Scar, who was climbing out of the sewer water and back onto the cobble path, using his broken leg despite the pain. "Why do you run?" asked the creature, genuinely confused. The insanity in its face moments before was replaced by a look of innocence. "I just want to eat you." The creature started its lumbering walk again, following Scar at a slow pace, talking to itself as it did. "Why does it run?" inquired the creature to itself, gluttony told it. The creature stopped, something seeming to have clicked in its mind. The horrifyingly insane smile that had been on its face a moment ago, returned. It licked its lips as Scar turned a corner, going out of its view. Gluttony told it, yes he did, he told it. The creature, identifying itself as Gluttony, started walking again, its eyes turning red as it did. "I can smell you. I can smell you." Scar increased his pace, a rare bout of fear pumping through his body as the beast behind him screamed madly. Scar suddenly dove forward as years of combat experience came to his aid and saved his life, barely avoiding Gluttony's jaws as it sailed over his body. Scar grunted in pain as his injured leg impacted with the hard cobble of the sewer. He looked up as the creature turned around and raced towards him, its mouth frothing and drooling as it did. Scar rolled to the side, once again just barely avoiding the creature as it crashed into the wall of the sewer. The creature pulled its head out of the wall, red lighting arsing around its skull, as the impact had apparently been strong enough to cave it in. It turned towards Scar and started stalking towards him again, this time moving much slower. Scar got up and started to run away, but was knocked back down when a chunk of the wall clipped his injured leg. He looked back at Gluttony, who was pulling another chunk of the wall out, this one much larger than the last one. "If it doesn't move, then Gluttony will be able to eat it," stated the creature to itself, as it managed to yank out a piece of rock about half the size of Scar, yes. "And then Lust will be happy with Gluttony, and Gluttony will be able to eat even more." Scar looked at Gluttony in horror, before noticing a spout of water coming out from where Gluttony had torn apart the wall. As Gluttony raved to itself about how tasty the little Ishvalin would be, Scar pressed his ear to the wall of the sewer. Sure enough, he could hear the rushing of water. "Now, little Ishvalin, die," cried out Gluttony as he reared his arm back to throw the piece of stone. Scar, seeing no other option, pressed his right hand up against the wall of the sewer. Blue lighting stretched down the entire length of the corridor. Gluttony turned his head to look down the sewer as a rumbling sound made its way down. Gluttony could do nothing more than scream as the walls of the sewer crumbled and over 10,000 gallons of water poured in, sweeping both Gluttony and Scar away into its unrelenting currents. For those who remember. Ed was staring at the rapidly moving landscape as the train he was riding on moved past the fields and meadows of eastern Amistris. Across from him sat Naruto, who was casually scribbling down ideas for his next book. Ed sighed, before looking to the person sitting next to him. "I still don't understand why Mustang sent you with me," stated Ed, annoyance lacing his voice. Armstrong looked down at Ed, before closing his copy of Makeout Paradise. "Mustang sent me to guard you and Alphonse. If an associate of Scar were to attack you too, you'd be nearly defenseless," replied Armstrong, opening his book once again. "I also can't believe how you can read that trash, Colonel," stated Ed, looking at the small orange book in Armstrong's hands in disgust. Armstrong turned towards Ed in genuine surprise before standing up and striking an interesting pose. "You would dare mock a literary masterpiece such as this?" accused Armstrong, holding his book up as though it were some holy relic. "You would call that smut a literary masterpiece?" questioned Ed, disbelief clear in his voice. "Why yes. Of course I would," exclaimed Armstrong, the volume of his voice only being exceeded by the exuberance with which he stated it. "It reflects the best in masculinity, iterating the cycle of birth and death with masterful precision." Ed was looking up at Armstrong with wide, unbelieving eyes. Ed didn't reply, instead turning back to his window and pressing his forehead to glass. Naruto chuckled at Ed's misfortune before turning to Armstrong, who had sat back in his seat and pulled out his book for the third time. "So, Mr. Armstrong, since you are guarding Ed, I assume that you are a state alchemist," stated Naruto, placing his notebook into his jacket. "That is correct," replied Armstrong, nodding. "I am Alex Lewis Armstrong, the Armstrong alchemist, practitioner of the Armstrong alchemy, which has been passed down the Armstrong family for generations." Armstrong stood up as he was saying this and struck a strongman pose as he finished his title. "I see," replied Naruto, seemingly unfazed by Armstrong's over-the-top way of speaking, "then I would guess that your alchemy is combat-oriented." "That is correct once again. My alchemy is the perfect combination of raw strength and finesse, accompanied by precise transmutations to construct anything with a simple punch of the fist." Armstrong pulled out a piece of chalk as he spoke and wrote an intricate transmutation circle on their cabin table. At the end of the speech, Armstrong lifted up his fist and punched directly in the center of the table. A bright light engulfed the table, blurring it from sight. When it reappeared, instead of a table there was a perfect sculpture of Armstrong's head in the center of the cabin. Naruto and Ed looked at the head in astonishment. "What the hell, Armstrong? We have to pay for that," cried out Ed. "Nonsense," replied Armstrong, "now everyone will be able to view my glorious visage for all of eternity." "But they won't be able to use the table," cried Ed, obviously annoyed. Armstrong put his hand up to his chin. "Yes, that is quite unfortunate," replied Armstrong matter-of-factly. "I guess I shall just have to rectify my mistake." Armstrong then raised his fist and punched the table again. Blue light engulfed it, and when it was visible again, Ed cried out in frustration, and Naruto laughed. Before them was indeed a table, however, the table was bright gold with small Armstrongs adorning the side in various positions of work. It looked quite reminiscent of Greek architecture and was as flamboyant as could be. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it illegal to make gold alchemically?" inquired Naruto. "Indeed," replied Armstrong, "however that is not gold, but pyrite." "Fool's gold," stated Naruto. "I still think they'll charge us for the table," stated Ed, sighing before once again returning to his window. "You can afford it," replied Naruto, turning to Armstrong. "Thank you for your explanation. It was most enlightening," stated Naruto, bowing his head to the larger man. "Although I must ask, why are you so free with your alchemy? Aren't you afraid of someone potentially stealing it?" Armstrong shook his head. "As I said earlier, my alchemy requires a perfect combination of strength and finesse, both of which I have spent my entire life honing. If there was someone who could match me physically and combatively, then they deserve to learn my alchemy." Naruto raised his eyebrows in surprise. "In that case, I challenge you to a spar when we reach Resemble," said Naruto. Armstrong looked at Naruto before smiling and nodding. "I shall anticipate it. Our fight will be a most youthful endeavor," replied Armstrong. Naruto seized up before looking at Armstrong with disbelief. "What did you just say?" inquired Naruto, his voice quiet. "I said our fight would be a most youthful endeavor," replied Armstrong, somewhat confused. "Is that something you say often?" asked Naruto, still quiet. Armstrong put his hand up to chin in a contemplative gesture before shaking his head in the negative. "No, I would have to say that this is the first time I have actually said that," said Armstrong, "although I do like how it sounds. I may use it in the future." "Is something wrong, Naruto?" inquired Ed, worried. "No," replied Naruto, shaking his head. "It's just it was a phrase a dear friend of mine had used a long time ago." "In that case, I shall use it in honor of this most youthful friend of yours," stated Armstrong, giving Naruto a thumbs up. Naruto looked at Armstrong even more disbelieving before nodding absently and leaning back into his chair. Naruto then seemed to remember something. "Hey Ed, where's Al?" inquired Naruto. Ed looked at Armstrong annoyed, sticking his thumb towards Armstrong. "This guy decided that Al needed some company, so instead of bringing Al in here with us, he put Al in the cargo car filled with sheep. I thought he would need some company, and I very well couldn't bring a disembodied hunk of armor onto the train car with us," replied Armstrong, folding his arms in an almost childish manner. "That hunk of armor is my brother," cried out Ed, even more annoyed with Armstrong's offhand response. Naruto laughed before a loud bell sounded, alerting the passengers that the next train station was coming up. I am pretty sure that this is our stop, stated Naruto, raising his arms and stretching. It is, replied Ed, getting up, reaching under his seat and pulling out his suitcase. Armstrong followed suit, although his suitcase was located inside an overhead compartment. I don't suppose you guys would want to get some lunch? Inquired Naruto. I'm famished. I'm up for it, how about you, Colonel? An Armstrong is always able to eat, replied Armstrong. Good, and I know Al won't object to being out and about after 5 hours inside a sheep pen, stated Naruto, as Ed glared at Armstrong. They got up when the train started to slow, and before long, they had stopped in front of Soli train station, the first and only train station of the small farm town of Soli. After getting off the train and retrieving Al, the quartet made their way towards Soli proper, Al being carried in a shipping crate on Armstrong's shoulder. However, as they were leaving the station, Armstrong made a cry of exclamation and pointed towards a man carrying some groceries about 30 feet away from them. Dr. Marco? Is that you? Called out Armstrong, waving at the man. The man looked at Armstrong for a second, then dropped his groceries and ran. Before they could even begin to start pursuing him, Marco had turned the street corner and was out of sight. Naruto turned to Armstrong. Who was that, and do you want me to catch him? Inquired Naruto, shuffling in his new boots in preparation. That man was Tim Marco, or at least looked like him, replied Armstrong, obviously troubled. He was one of the military's top researchers during the Ishvalan War, as well as one of the leading minds in the possible medical application of alchemy. However, he was said to have disappeared, taking all of his research with him. We have not been able to find him since. What was your relationship with him? If you could recognize him at a glance, that would suggest that you spent a great deal of time with the man, said Naruto. He was my psychiatrist, replied Armstrong. I thought you said he was a top researcher, stated Ed, pointing out the possible contradiction. Armstrong looked down at Ed. I was his only patient. Armstrong turned to Naruto and sighed, leave him be. We'll find him again. No need to frighten him. Naruto just shrugged, sticking his hands in his pockets. Okay, as you said, we'll find him eventually. Naruto then walked forward, picking up the doctor's groceries. He picked an apple out from it, bit into it, and turned to face the trio. Just remember. Eventually can be an awfully long time. Armstrong held up the picture of Marco he had drawn, portraying the old doctor with surprising accuracy. The shopkeeper whom they had just bought lunch from took a look at the picture, before nodding. That is Dr. Morrow. He lives outside town, a mile or so east of the train station, stated the shopkeeper. The man then frowned. You're not gonna try to do anything to the good doctor, are you? Absolutely not. He's just an old acquaintance of mine who I saw my way in, but unfortunately, could not contact. Good, because that doctor has done nothing but good for us since he moved here, and we would like it to stay like that. Armstrong nodded before tucking the picture back into his blue military coat. He turned and looked down at Ed and Naruto, who were munching on large sandwiches. May I see the picture, Mr. Armstrong? Requested Al from his place on Armstrong's shoulder. Certainly. Replied Armstrong, reaching back into his coat and pulling out the picture, holding it up so that Al could see. Wow, Mr. Armstrong, you are really good. It looks exactly like him, exclaimed Al. The art of portraiture has been past the Armstrong family for generations, replied Armstrong, almost as if it were second nature. Well, since we have found out where he lives, stated Ed, his voice muffled by a mouthful of sandwich, want to head over and see if he's home? Yes, I have a few questions for Marco, which I would very much like to answered, replied Armstrong seriously. What do you intend to do with him after you have those questions answered? Inquired Naruto. He is, by definition, a deserter. If you were to follow military law, you would be required to capture him until further sentencing, or should you be unable to resolve matters peacefully, kill him. Armstrong looked down at Naruto, a frown covering his face. That is a dark thought indeed, one that will be dictated by Marco's answers. Without another word, Armstrong headed towards the train station and eventually, Dr. Morrow's house. Armstrong knocked on the door to Dr. Morrow's residence, 1 mile east of Soli train station. A moment later, Armstrong could hear the distinct sound of bolts sliding behind the door. Armstrong was not able to say anything due to the fact that there was a gun barrel in front of him, held in the hands of the man that they were searching for. Alright Armstrong, what are you doing here? Are you here to take me back? Because if you are, you're a dead man, stated the terrified doctor. Armstrong shook his head, holding up his hands placatingly. No doctor, that is not why I am here, replied Armstrong calmly, now please put down the goo. Then you are here to kill me, don't think I won't kill you because I was your fucking psychiatrist. Marco stopped mid-rant as his pistol was forcefully removed from his hands. The voice came from behind Marco, and the barrel of his gun was suddenly under his chin. You know, Mr. Marco, came Naruto's voice, it is unwise to threaten my friends. Marco nodded, his breathing becoming slightly labored. Now, are you going to be civil and hear what Armstrong has to say? Marco nodded again. Good. Naruto smiled before coughing, spewing blood onto the doctor's shoulder. Armstrong and Ed rushed to Naruto, who was swaying heavily. Marco turned and looked at his assailant for a moment before letting his medical instinct take over. Marco grabbed Naruto and led him to his kitchen table where a chair was located. Marco sat Naruto down before placing his hand onto Naruto's chest. The place that Marco touched began to glow an almost herbal-looking green. He took his hand away a moment later and looked at Naruto with astonishment. What the hell was that? Inquired Ed, totally confused by what the doctor had done. Marco looked over at Ed before sighing. I scanned his body using alchemy, replied Marco, and what I found was quite disturbing. Wait. Interrupted Ed, how did you scan his body? Something as useful as that should be commonplace amongst modern-day alchemy, shouldn't it? Marco nodded, shaking his head and looking toward Naruto, who was breathing slightly easier. I have no doubt it would be, but the price of learning is too high, replied Marco, seemingly disturbed. He placed his hand up against Naruto's chest again. In alchemy, there are 3 phases, continued Marco, taking a deep breath. Yeah, replied Ed, understanding, deconstruction, reconstruction. Correct, stated Marco, his hand beginning to glow green as he moved it over to Naruto's arms. When I place my hand on the flesh, I understand, then I deconstruct and reconstruct the cells in the exact same formation that they were in, effectively giving me a mental image of the body and the affected regions, even if they are internal. Marco took his hand off of Naruto's chest before looking at him with accusing eyes. Young man, began Marco, causing Naruto to smile, what in the hell did you do to your lungs? They're almost completely collapsed, not to mention nearly a quarter of your left lung is missing. I don't even know how you are breathing, let alone moving so fast. Naruto was still smiling at the young man's statement. I've had a rather strenuous life up until now, replied Naruto, wiping some of the blood away from his mouth. I've yet to meet someone who can fix my lungs, but I am quite capable of many things, despite their state of being. Besides, they cannot exactly be healed by conventional methods. Marco looked at Naruto incredulously before reaching into his pocket. Then you wouldn't mind if I had a go at them? Stated Marco, pulling his hand out of his pocket, apparently holding something. I can assure you, my methods are anything but conventional. Actually, I would mind, replied Naruto, tensing up slightly, if you don't remember, I was holding a gun up to your head a few moments ago. Marco looked at Naruto before smiling slightly. Sir, I'm not a dangerous person by nature, but if it satisfies you, I will allow you to shoot me, state Marco obviously knowing something. Naruto looked at Marco, seeming confused. Naruto's eyes seemed to light up in understanding before lifting the gun up and pulling the slide back to look into the chamber. He then pulled the magazine out of Marco's gun before chuckling. The magazine was empty. What if we actually were here to arrest you? Inquired Al from Armstrong's shoulder. Marco looked at Al in absolute surprise, not expecting the armor to be able to speak. Marco couldn't form words as he looked at Al, slowly realizing that the armor's eye slots were glowing red. Ed and Al sighed. Dr. Marco, began Ed, holding his hand up as if he were presenting an attraction, meet my brother, Alphonse Elric. Marco looked at the two before breathing in sharply. You two committed the taboo? Breathed Marco, unbelieving. The two brothers nodded. Marco made a strangled sound before stumbling back slightly, his legs seeming to go weak. But you two are so young, stated Marco, putting his hand up to his face and wiping away phantom sweat. Did you see it? Ed looked at Marco, thoroughly surprised, before slowly nodding. All color left Marco's face as he fell down, the information the brothers giving him apparently being too much. What did you learn? Inquired Marco, his voice faint. What do you mean? Asked Ed, confused by Marco's question. When one passes through the gate, he bestows upon them the gift of information and knowledge that would usually take a lifetime to accumulate, but at a price. He looked at Ed, or more specifically, Ed's arm and leg. He gifted me with the analyzing alchemy I just showed you, as well as great amounts of knowledge pertaining to the creation of the celestial philosopher's stone. Marco sighed, but was shaken from his thoughts, literally, by Ed rushing up to him and grabbing him by his shirt and lifting him up. You know how to create a philosopher's stone? Cried out Ed in surprise, hope and elation in his voice. Marco looked at Ed blankly, before laughing morbidly. Yes, I know how to create those despicable stones. I wish to any divine being that exists that I didn't, but I do, stated Marco, despairingly. We must know how to make them. It is very important, stated Ed, shaking Marco. The man shook his head. Young man, I can guarantee that you don't want anything to do with those stones. They are the devil's creation. No. Denied Ed, dropping the man. I need to know, for my brother's sake, I need to know. Marco looked at Ed with wide eyes, before frowning. "You are set in your ways," spoke Marco, shaking his head and standing up. "I'm sorry, but I cannot help you. However, I can tell you that the Philosopher's Stone is not your answer." Ed looked at Marco, not quite comprehending what the man was telling him. "You know how to make a Philosopher's Stone," stated Ed, fury underlying his voice, "the one thing that can pay the price for my brother's body, and you will not reveal the method because you believe we'll be scarred by it. Sorry that we know how it is made. That we'll regret knowing. I'm sorry, doctor, but there are some things that I need to know, no matter the cost, and the Philosopher's Stone is one of them." Marco shook his head before walking over to Naruto and placing his hand on the man's chest. A moment later, red light engulfed Naruto's chest. When the light faded, Naruto wheezed out before taking a massive breath and leaping up. "It's been a long time since I've been able to breathe." Naruto took another deep breath, normally. Naruto looked at Marco, a new light in his eyes. "What did you do that was different?" inquired Naruto, looking down at Marco's clasped palm. "I did nothing different than what I would have otherwise done," replied Marco, "just simple alchemy. Now, if that is all, I would ask that you don't tell the military where I am and be on your way." Naruto shook his head. "No, those injuries were caused by something that only soul energy could cure, not alchemy," stated Naruto, slowly advancing on Marco. "Something was augmenting your alchemy." Marco began to back away, clearly scared and slightly angry from his and Ed's dispute not a moment prior, but stopped at the mention of soul energy. What do you mean?" inquired Marco, fear clearly on his face. "Takra," stated Naruto, a wild look appearing in his eyes as he disappeared from view. He appeared a moment later, behind Marco, holding a small vial filled a quarter way with blood-red liquid. Naruto took a deep breath, satisfied with his apparently renewed lungs. Naruto looked at the vial intensely, before sighing dejectedly. He tossed the vial to Ed, before grabbing the back of Marco's head, leading him over to his table, and slamming the doctor's face onto the wooden surface. "What do you make of that, Ed?" inquired Naruto, looking as if he were going to continue when a large hand grasped his shoulder and forcefully removed him from Marco. "I would ask that you not injure my psychiatrist, Naruto, especially with how cordial he's been with you," stated Armstrong angrily, removing his hand from Naruto's shoulder and picking Marco up off his table. "Before you go defending your beloved doctor, let's hear what Ed has to say about that vial over there," stated Naruto, looking over to Ed, who uncorked the stopper of the vial and dipped his finger into the liquid. Ed's eyes widened his eyes when his finger came into contact with the liquid inside, only for the liquid to harden like a solid. "Well," began Ed, removing his finger from the vial and swishing its contents around before placing his finger on the liquid, resulting in its hardening once again, "it seems to some kind of highly reactive non-Newtonian fluid." Ed reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of chalk, scribbling down a quick transmutation circle. He then grasped the vial in his palm and placed it onto the edge of the circle. Red light engulfed the circle. Ed smirked before picking up his creation. "Just as I thought," stated Ed, holding out the largest diamond the group had ever seen. "It also augments the output of alchemy, increasing it and breaking the fundamental laws of equivalent exchange." Ed then took the diamond and lobbed it as hard as he could at Marco. The stone was stopped mid-flight by Armstrong's hand, who placed the stone down on the table before looking at Ed sternly. "You bastard, you had a Philosopher's Stone all this time?" yelled out Ed, his fury reaching new heights. Marco sighed before shaking his head. "No, that stone is flawed. Unlike the Philosopher's Stone of myth, if used too heavily or too frequently, it will disperse into dust. When I left the military, that vial was full to the brim," stated Marco, turning to Naruto. "What happened to you? From what you said, your injuries were caused by something that could only be cured by soul energy." Naruto looked down at Marco before looking over to the vial that Ed was picking up. "I have a question for you, Marco," stated Naruto, deciding not to respond to Marco's inquiry. "What is your flawed Philosopher's Stone made of?" Marco frowned before leaning back towards the table, putting his face into his hands, sorrow overcoming him. During the war, the military high command began intensive research into the possible creation of a Philosopher's Stone. Marco reached into his pocket, pulled out a second, much smaller vial and uncorked it. "I have been the head of research into the stone ever since I showed a particular aptitude for thinking outside of the box, if you will. After 20 years of research, our results pointed to one thing, one horribly simple thing." He poured the liquid from the vial onto the table. The liquid, instead of splashing, remained together and formed a perfect sphere. "My trip through the gate only confirmed my research and was the final push I needed to get full military funding." Marco looked up to Ed, who was looking at the stone with utter surprise. The Philosopher's Stone is supposed to be a perfect substance, a combination of liquid and solid. Even with all of its impurities, there is only thing that even comes close to being completely perfect. Marco picked up the stone, looking at it with weary eyes, before holding it out for Ed to hold. Ed reached forward and held the stone in his hand, feeling its weight. "What is that?" inquired Ed, holding the stone up next to stone in the vial. Human life, stated Marco, watching Ed intensely. Every experience, emotion, feeling, want, dream. Everything that makes us human. That incomplete philosopher's stone that you are holding is distilled from the collective souls of over 900 Ishvalan prisoners of war. We then used it to empower our alchemists, inevitably supplying us with more prisoners to fuel the never-ending search for the perfect philosopher's stone. Ed stood there, completely stunned, looking at the stone in his hands in horror. He swayed, before falling onto his knees, still looking at the stone. You're saying that the one thing that my brother and I have been searching for, the one thing that could solve our problems and get Al's body back, is made of, and can only be created with human souls? Inquired Ed, grasping the stone and looking up to Marco with pleading eyes. Correct, replied Marco, placing his vial onto the philosopher's stone in front of him. There is no other way. Ed's head sunk and he just stared at the floor for a great deal of time. Then, after minutes of complete silence, Ed, surprisingly, laughed. It figures that after all of this time searching, when we finally find a means of getting the stone, that something like this would come along and fuck up our plan. Ed then stood up. If this is the only way to make a philosopher's stone, then I guess that we just won't use one. He looked over to his brother, who only nodded in the affirmative. Marco looked at the two brothers in amazement before shaking his head and placing his philosopher's stone into his pocket. You two are quite the amazing pair, and I wish you luck in your search. I'm truly sorry that you didn't find what you were looking for. He looked up Armstrong before turning and looking at Naruto. How did you figure out that the stones used soul energy, or for that matter, how did you receive an injury that you claim could be healed by soul energy? Naruto's eyes widened, realizing his slip-up, before sighing. My people specialize in the usage and manipulation of one's soul in order to achieve superhuman feats of strength, agility, and alchemy, stated Naruto monotonously, sounding as though he had said those exact words 1,000 times prior. What do you mean? Inquired Marco, intrigued. How can one manipulate their soul? You do so whenever you perform alchemy. Your mind understands the processes going on within the transmutation, however it is your soul that compels the substances involved to bend to your will. My people have developed a way to just use your soul as the required substance. It is like alchemy to your alchemy, similar but fundamentally different. Naruto took a deep breath, seeming to have prepared this speech well in advance. Wait, you use your soul? Doesn't that, kill you? Inquired Ed, disbelieving. Naruto looked to Ed, before sighing. No, one's soul is an infinitely replenishable source of energy. Although one can overexert their souls, simple everyday activities such as eating your favorite food or exercising on time will be all that is needed to refill one's soul. How does one interact with their soul though? Inquired Marco. If you are able to use your soul in such a way, why haven't we been able to use our souls similarly? As I said, you use your soul as the final component in alchemy in order to manipulate the materials involved. To use your soul like I do, however, you need to spark it at a very young age. Spark it? I've never found a good analogy for this, stated Naruto, putting his hand up to his chin, thinking of what he was going to say next. Imagine that your soul is candle. When you are born, your candle is small and can only provide a very small amount of light for an even smaller amount of time. As you go through your life, you experience new things, and your candle grows larger and accumulates more wax, causing it to produce more light and sustain itself for a longer time. After a while, however, your candle stops growing and the wax engulfs the wick, thus preventing your candle from ever being lit. This happens around ages 12 to 14, when you start growing into maturity and have to deal with the hardships of life and the desires of adulthood. However, if one is able to light their wick before it is engulfed by the wax, then they will be able to use their candle as a light and allow it to grow larger, all the while keeping the wax at bay. If one doesn't use their candle for a long time, then the wax will start encroach onto the wick and if left unabated, will cover your wick and you will never be able to light it again, or at the very least, be incredibly hindered as you try to burn away the accumulated wax. Once again, Naruto took a deep breath and looked at his audience to see their reaction. Marco was in deep thought, debating on whether or not to believe what he had just heard. Ed, on the other hand, was having a more visible reaction. Our souls are candles. Inquired Ed, between laughs. You do know how ridiculous that explanation sounds, right? Naruto frowned before crossing his arms, clearly disliking Ed's reaction. Do not be so quick to disregard something until it is proven false, replied Naruto. Unfortunately, Mr. Uzumaki, I shall have to agree with Ed on this account, said Armstrong. Your explanation leaves much to be desired. Who are these people you say you come from, and why have we never encountered them before? How does your alchemy differ from ours? I believe that a display of your soul-based alchemy is in order, should you wish to convince us fully. And if it is proven that you can manipulate your soul to perform extraordinary feats of alchemy, then I would wish to extend a formal invitation into Amistrus's State Alchemist program." Ed and Marco turned to Armstrong, surprise on their faces. "What?" cried Ed, clearly surprised by Armstrong's statement. Armstrong turned toward Ed, looking down at him. "What are the 3 rules of the State Alchemist, Ed?" inquired Armstrong, obviously attempting to make a point. Ed frowned, but complied. "Obey the military. Do not create gold. Do not create humans," Ed sighed. "Colonel, what does this have to do with anything?" Armstrong held up his hand. "Now define the first rule, obey the military," requested Armstrong. "To obey the orders of my superiors," replied Ed, annoyed. "That is not completely correct," stated Armstrong, "to devote oneself to the military hierarchy and to the protection, advancement, and well-being of Amistrus, that is what obey the military means in its entirety. If Mr. Uzumaki here can do as he states, then I am obligated by my status as State Alchemist to try to enlist him into our ranks. This is generally the case with most promising alchemists that the military gets wind of. I believe it was Colonel Mustang who was sent to enlist you too." Ed nodded, annoyed at the lecture, but ultimately understanding what the colonel was trying to get across. They both turned toward Naruto, who was still frowning, although for a different reason now. "This is the exact reason why I don't advertise myself," thought Naruto, talking to himself more out of habit than anything else. "I talk about how my abilities work, and not a second later, the local military is already trying to get their hands on me." "I will show you," stated Naruto, holding his hand up to stop any words Quartet might have said, "but not here, I will show you once we get to reassemble." Naruto turned to Marco, who was frowning. Marco held up his hand however, silencing anything Naruto might have said. "I understand," stated Marco, sighing. I was doing the same when you 4 came in. You don't want some unknown stranger being aware of what you can do, especially if they can somehow recreate what you had worked so hard to accomplish. I don't like it, but I understand." Marco then turned his head and looked out of his window to see the twilight skies of eastern Amistrus. He walked to his table and picked up the chair that had been knocked down when Naruto had thrust his face into the aforementioned table. "Well, now is when I make dinner. So if you are staying then I shall make enough for us all. However, the next train after the 8 o'clock is in the morning." He looked at a wall clock located near his front door. "You have about 20 minutes to reach the station before the train leaves." Armstrong shook his head. "We shall not inconvenience you further, Doctor. I am sorry for the mess we have made, and I shall personally come at a later date to pay for any damages we may have caused." Marco laughed. "Alex, please don't take this the wrong way, but I'd prefer if you didn't come back. The less military personnel visiting my house, the better." Armstrong nodded, before bowing slightly to Marco and heading towards the door, Ed and Naruto in tow, Al still on his shoulder. "Oh, and Ed," stated Marco, grabbing the elder Elric's attention. "Yes," replied Ed. "I know you two don't want to use the method I have developed to create your Philosopher's Stone, but if you want to, you can take a look at my research notes. Perhaps you can get a sense of where you would like to start from there." "Really?" Ed's eyes lit up like Christmas lights at the prospect. "Yes, they are located in First Library's cooking section, level 8, replied Marco, smiling at the quartet's reaction. "However, I must warn you, my research is quite detailed. I was a much more ruthless man in my youth, and there are some things there that I am not proud of." Marco's smile had left his lips, a grimace having replaced it. "Just make sure that, no matter what, if you cannot find another way, you don't use my way. It will weigh on your conscience for the rest of your lives. You're good boys. Don't let desperation ruin that." Ed and Al looked at the doctor, who was watching at them with pleading eyes. Ed nodded, holding his left hand up to his heart. "I promise," replied Ed, looking up to his brother. "As do I," confirmed Al, bowing his head as much as he could. "Edward," interjected Armstrong, looking at the wall clock, "we must leave soon, or else we may not reach the train in time." Armstrong gave one last nod to Marco, before turning and leaving through the door. The elder Elric and Naruto followed close behind, all making haste towards Soli train station. Ed, once again, was looking out of the window of train car, watching as the landscape sped by. Next to him was his brother, who speaking with Armstrong about the Armstrong family estate and the large rose bushes that surrounded it. Across from him was Naruto, who was scribbling away on his notebook, seemingly oblivious to the world around him. He opened his palm to look at the vile red liquid in his hand. He had forgotten to return it to Marco, so now it was in his possession until he could find a time when he would see the doctor again. "That must be similar to what God feels like," stated Naruto, gaining Ed's attention, although the other two were so enraptured in their conversation. Ed nodded, holding the vial up so that he could see it more clearly in the overhead light of the cabin. "Hundreds of souls, in the palm of your hand," continued Naruto. "This is the culmination of everything that a person is, ended in a single moment, doomed to a fate worse than death. To forever be the source of power for another, to never again being able to taste, touch, hear, see, or smell. To simply exist is a fate I would wish on no one, not even my worst enemies or the most horrible of people. Ed just continued to look at the vial before placing it onto the cab table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his piece of chalk, quickly scribbling a transmutation circle onto the corner of the table. He placed the vial onto the center of the circle and touched the edge of the circle. A bright blue light flashed, interrupting Al and Armstrong from their conversation, having been amazingly oblivious to the machinations of Ed up until this point. When the blue light faded, instead of a vial, there was crystalline dodecahedron filled with the remains of the incomplete Philosopher's Stone. Connected to the dodecahedron was a metal chain. Ed picked up the necklace and held it up. "I promise," stated Ed, speaking to stone within the crystal, "to each of you in there, you will have a body and will live once again." He then slid the chain over his head, tucking it under his ponytail before stuffing the stone into his shirt. He then looked up, realizing the show he had just made for the three around him, and blushing slightly in embarrassment. "Sorry," stated Ed, "you two should continue your conversation." Armstrong shook his head. "No, what you did was a most youthful act and should be treated as such. Upon arriving in Resemble, I will buy you a copy of the wonderful Makeout Paradise, and we shall revel in the wonder that is literary enlightenment. That smut is not a literary masterpiece, and keep that garbage away from my brother, or I swear, I will rip that little piece of hair out of your head and find the rest of your books and burn them." Naruto chuckled as the two continued to yell at the other, one proclaiming the book to be a work of the gods and the other claiming that it was garbage. He took another deep breath, relishing in the feeling, before closing his notebook and looking out into the inky blackness of the night. "I think I may start training again," thought Naruto, before leaning his head into the cushion of his seat and falling into a light sleep, thoughts of chakra and philosopher's stones going through his head. Marco sighed as he placed his plate into his kitchen sink, having just finished a meager dinner of what he could scrounge up from inside his icebox. "I guess I am going to have to go shopping again," he thought to himself. He was shaken from his thoughts by a knock on his door. Who could that be at this hour? Marco wondered, it can't possibly be Alex again. He thought it wasn't entirely impossible that someone from the town had an emergency nighttime call. It had happened a few times before. He walked up to his door, unbolting its numerous locks. Upon opening the door, he stumbled back, horror covering his face. Standing in the doorway was a woman unlike any other. "Oh, is that how you greet an old acquaintance?" the woman cooed as she flicked back her waist-length black hair and stepped over the threshold. The woman was the definition of femininity, possessing inhuman amounts of grace and beauty. Her eyes, which were a shade of red that could only be found in the finest of wines, looked over Marco with cruel disdain. She exuded an aura of pure animal desire that would cause longing in the eyes of any man. The clothes she wore only accentuated that fact. A calf-length, strapless one-piece dress was her clothing of choice, and long black gloves extended all the way up to her shoulder. On the center of the woman's chest, just below the collarbone, an Ouroboros tattoo was proudly shown. "How did you find me?" inquired Marco fearfully, his hand slowly moving to his pocket. The woman chuckled before extending her hand up and pointing her index finger toward Marco. The appendage rapidly lengthened, and before Marco knew what was happening, he found his hand speared by the woman's finger. Marco cried out in pain and attempted to pull the finger out of his flesh, but found it riveted in place, the finger several times stronger than any steel. The woman walked forward, her high heels clacking on the wood of the house. The extended finger shortened as she walked forward, aligning itself so that it was twisting the skin in Marco's hand as her angle changed with every step. She crouched down in front of the doctor, giving her finger one final twist before wrenching it out of Marco's hand. "Did you really think you could hide forever?" the woman asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Marco couldn't reply, the combination of terror and pain rendering him speechless. It was only a matter of time before word spread of a miracle doctor who could cure anyone of their ills. The woman leaned forward so that her mouth was next to Marco's ear. "You slipped up, Marco." The wet thump resounded throughout the house. Marco looked in abstract horror as he watched the woman's body slide down a cone of wood that rose from the floor. However, instead of blood, the wound spilled red lighting, and before Marco could do more than scream, the woman's hand lashed out and impacted into Marco's face, launching him into the wall of his house. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was the form of the woman cutting herself from the spike of wood and another walking into his house, carrying a large black bag. What if Naruto is an immortal Fullmetal Alchemist? End here, and thanks for watching my video till the end.